Hello, horror lovers. If spine-chilling true stories are your nightly ritual, you've come to the right place. Before we dive into tonight's terrifying true stories, make sure to subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to me. Don't forget to like this video and share where you're watching from in the comments below. Your support helps us bring you the best in real horror storytelling. Turn off your lights, look under your bed. Don't listen to this while sitting in the bathroom. And if you have a weak heart, stop this video now. Let's get into the stories. I thought I was prepared for anything when I took the job as a night watchman at the old manor on the outskirts of town. The place had been abandoned for years, but the new owners wanted to restore it and needed someone to keep an eye on things during the renovation. It seemed straightforward enough, a quiet job with a decent paycheck and no one around to bother me. Little did I know this job would turn out to be far more unsettling than I could have ever imagined. The manor was a large, sprawling estate with a dark history. Local legends spoke of it being the site of occult rituals decades ago, but most people dismissed it as just old gossip. Still, there was an undeniable creepiness to the place. Its once grand facade was now weathered and overgrown with vines, the windows dark and lifeless. My shift started at dusk, and as I settled into my small security office, I felt a shiver of unease. The manor creaked and groaned in the wind, and every sound seemed amplified in the silence. I tried to shake off the feeling, reminding myself that it was just an old building, and that my job was simply to monitor the security cameras and check the premises every hour. Around midnight, I was going through the footage from the cameras, and I noticed something odd. In one of the frames, a shadow seemed to move across the screen, darting past a door that had been securely locked. I rewound the footage and watched it again, but the shadow was gone. It was probably just a glitch, I told myself, but the unease in my stomach grew stronger. As the hours passed, the sense of dread only intensified. The manor seemed to come alive at night, the sounds of creaking floorboards and distant thumps making it hard to focus. I conducted my rounds, walking through the dimly lit hallways and checking the various rooms. Everything appeared as it should, dusty and deserted, but as I approached the basement stairs, I noticed something strange. The door to the basement, which had always been locked, was now slightly ajar. My heart raced as I stared at the gap, my mind racing with thoughts of what could be down there. I tried to convince myself it was just a draft, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I hesitated for a moment, then decided to investigate. I grabbed a flashlight and carefully made my way down the stairs. The air in the basement was cold and damp, and the faint smell of mildew filled my nostrils. My flashlight beam cut through the darkness, revealing old furniture covered in sheets and stacks of dusty boxes. As I reached the bottom of the stairs, I heard a low, rhythmic chanting coming from somewhere in the basement. My blood ran cold as I tried to locate the source of the sound. The chanting was faint but unmistakable, like a distant echo from a forgotten time. I followed the sound, my flashlight trembling in my hand. The chanting grew louder as I approached a large wooden door at the far end of the basement. It was old and weathered, covered in strange symbols that seemed to glow faintly in the darkness. The door was slightly ajar, and the chanting was coming from within. I pushed the door open just a crack and peered inside. What I saw made my blood run cold. The room was lit by flickering candles arranged in a circle on the floor. In the center of the circle stood a group of robed figures, their faces obscured by hoods. They were chanting in a language I didn't recognize, their voices blending together in a haunting melody. I watched in horror as the figures moved in unison, their hands raised towards the ceiling. The air was thick with an oppressive energy, and I could feel the weight of their presence pressing down on me. I wanted to turn and run, but my feet felt rooted to the spot. My body paralyzed by fear died as I stood there, frozen in place. One of the figures turned towards me. Even though the hood obscured their face, I could feel their gaze piercing through me. The chanting stopped abruptly, and the room fell into a deafening silence. The figure raised a hand, and I felt an icy chill wash over me. I stumbled back, the flashlight slipping from my grip and rolling across the floor. I turned and fled up the stairs, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't stop until I was outside, gasping for breath and trying to make sense of what I had just witnessed. I went to the police the next morning, reporting what I had seen. They investigated, but when they searched the basement, there was no sign of the robed figures or the strange symbols. The candles had burned out, and the room was empty, just old furniture and dusty boxes. I quit my job that day, unable to shake the feeling of dread that had settled over me. I never returned to the manor, and I never spoke of what I had seen to anyone but the police. The manor was eventually sold and renovated, but I couldn't help but wonder if the cult's rituals had ever truly stopped, or if they were simply waiting for the next unsuspecting soul to stumble upon their dark practices. Sometimes, late at night, I think I can still hear the chanting echoing in my mind like a distant memory, and I wonder if the circle of shadows still there, waiting in the darkness for the next person to wander to close. My name is Dale, and I've been a park ranger for nearly 15 years. I've spent most of my life in the wilderness, surrounded by the majesty of nature. The peace and solitude of the forest have always been a source of comfort for me, but there was one night deep in the heart of the twilight woods that shattered that sense of safety, a night that still haunts me every time I close my eyes. It started like any other evening. The sun was setting, casting long shadows through the trees, the air cool and crisp with the scent of pine. I was on the last patrol of the day, checking the trails and making sure all the campers were safe and accounted for. The Twilight Woods is a vast and dense forest known for its towering trees and thick underbrush. It's easy to get lost if you're not familiar with the area, which is why we always make sure to keep a close watch on anyone venturing too far off the beaten path. I was about halfway through my patrol when I got a call on the radio. It was from one of the other rangers, Jim, who was stationed at the main entrance to the park. He sounded tense, which was unusual for him. "Dale, we've got a problem," he said. "A family reported seeing something strange near their campsite. They said it was, well, they weren't sure what it was, but it scared them pretty bad. Can you check it out?" I agreed and asked for the location. It was in a remote part of the park, an area that didn't see much traffic. The family had been camping in a small clearing near the river, a spot that was popular with those looking to escape the more crowded areas. I made my way there, the forest growing darker as the last light of day faded. By the time I arrived at the campsite, the sun had fully set, and the woods were shrouded in darkness. The family was huddled around a small fire, their faces pale and drawn. They looked relieved when they saw me, but there was still a palpable tension in the air. I introduced myself and asked them what had happened. The father, a middle-aged man with graying hair, spoke first. "We were just sitting around the fire when we heard something moving in the trees," he said. "At first we thought it was just an animal, maybe a deer or a bear. But then we saw it. It was ... It was tall, much taller than any man, and it moved so quickly. It was like a shadow. but it had glowing eyes. It was watching us. His voice trembled as he spoke, and his wife and two children nodded in agreement. They all looked genuinely terrified. I assured them that I would check it out and that they were safe as long as they stayed by the fire. I took out my flashlight and began to scan the area around the campsite. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the trees and bushes. I saw nothing out of the ordinary at first, just the usual sounds of the forest at night, the rustling of leaves, and the occasional call of an owl. But then, just as I was about to turn back and tell the family that everything was fine, I saw it. It was standing just beyond the edge of the clearing, half hidden behind a tree. At first I thought it was just a trick of the light, a shadow cast by the trees. But then it moved, and I realized with a jolt of fear that it was something else entirely. The creature was tall, easily over 7 feet, and its body was gaunt and twisted. Its skin was a sickly gray, and its eyes glowed with an unnatural light. It had long, bony arms that hung down to its knees, and its fingers ended in sharp, claw-like tips. It moved with a fluidity that was almost hypnotic, like a predator stalking its prey. For a moment I was frozen in place, my mind struggling to comprehend what I was seeing. Then, as if sensing my gaze, the creature turned its head towards me. Those glowing eyes locked onto mine, and I felt a cold, creeping dread spread through my body. It was as if the very air around me had turned to ice. I did the only thing I could think of. I raised my flashlight and shined it directly at the creature. The light seemed to irritate it, and it let out a low, guttural growl that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. The creature took a step back, retreating into the shadows, but it didn't take its eyes off me. I backed away slowly, keeping the light trained on it until I reached the edge of the clearing. Then I turned and ran back to the campsite. The family was waiting for me, their faces filled with fear and hope. I didn't want to scare them any more than they already were, but I knew I couldn't lie to them. "We need to leave," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. Now they didn't argue. We quickly packed up their camp, and I led them back to the main trail. The whole time I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see the creature following us. But there was nothing, just the darkness of the forest and the sound of our footsteps. When we reached the ranger station, I made sure the family was safe and settled before heading inside to report what had happened. Jim was waiting for me, his face a mixture of concern and curiosity. I told him everything, but even as I spoke, I could see the doubt in his eyes. "Are you sure it wasn't just a bear or something?" he asked, trying to make sense of it. I shook my head. "No, Jim, I know what I saw. And whatever it wasn't a bear." He didn't press the issue, but I could tell he didn't fully believe me. I couldn't blame him. If I hadn't seen it with my own eyes, I wouldn't have believed it either. The rest of the night passed uneventfully, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every rustle of leaves, every shadow seemed to take on a new, sinister meaning. I stayed on high alert, but the creature never showed itself again. The family left the park the next morning, and I haven't seen them since. But I still think about that night, about the creature in the woods. I've patrolled the twilight woods many times since then, always keeping an eye out for anything unusual, but I never saw it again. Some nights, when the wind is just right, I swear I can hear that low growl echoing through the trees, a reminder that the forest holds secrets far darker than we can imagine. I don't know what the creature was or where it came from, but I do know one thing: it's still out there, watching, waiting. And I'll never forget the terror I felt when those glowing eyes locked onto mine. Working the night shift as a security guard at an old, abandoned warehouse was never on my list of dream jobs, but I needed the money, and the position was open. The warehouse was massive, a relic of the city's industrial past, with towering shelves filled with dust-covered crates and rusting machinery that hadn't been used in decades. It was the kind of place that felt frozen in time, a forgotten corner of the world where nothing ever happened to her, so I thought that my first few nights on the job were uneventful. The warehouse was silent except for the occasional creak of metal and the distant hum of machinery that seemed to echo from somewhere deep within the building. I would make my rounds, checking the doors and windows, ensuring everything was secure before settling into the small security office with its ancient monitors and outdated equipment. But on my fifth night, something changed. It started around 2 a.m., when I was making my usual rounds through the dimly lit corridors. As I walked past one of the long rows of shelves, I heard a faint sound, like a soft whisper, coming from somewhere deep within the warehouse. I stopped, straining to listen, but the sound had already faded away, leaving only the oppressive silence. I tried to brush it off, telling myself it was just the wind or the building settling. But there was something about that whisper that sent a shiver down my spine. It was too clear, too deliberate to be a mere trick of the wind. I continued my rounds, moving a little faster this time, eager to get back to the safety of the security office. As I turned the corner towards the office, I froze. The door to one of the storage rooms, a door that I was sure I had locked, was slightly ajar. My heart began to race as I approached the door, the flashlight in my hand trembling slightly. I pushed the door open and shone the light inside, expecting to find nothing but dust and old crates. But instead I saw something that made my blood run cold. In the center of the room, surrounded by a circle of faintly glowing symbols etched into the concrete floor, stood a figure. It was tall and thin, its skin pale and almost translucent in the dim light. Its eyes were sunken and hollow, staring blankly ahead as if it didn't even notice I was there. For a moment, I was too stunned to move, my mind struggling to make sense of what I was seeing. Then, as if sensing my presence, the figure slowly turned its head to face me. Its eyes, dark and empty, seemed to bore into my soul, and a wave of terror washed over me, paralyzing me where I stood. The figure took a step towards me, and I snapped out of my trance, stumbling backwards out of the room. I slammed the door shut and bolted down the corridor, not daring to look back. I could feel its gaze on me, feel the weight of its presence pressing down on me as I ran. I reached the security office and locked the door behind me, my hands shaking uncontrollably. I slumped into the chair, gasping for breath, trying to calm the rising panic that threatened to overwhelm me. I glanced at the monitors, but the cameras showed nothing out of the ordinary, just empty corridors and rows of shelves, silent and still. For the rest of the night, I stayed in the office, too terrified to leave. I kept the door locked and watched the monitors, waiting for any sign of movement, any hint that the figure was still out there. But the hours passed in silence, and eventually the first light of dawn began to filter through the dirty windows. When my shift ended, I left the warehouse without looking back. I quit the job the next day, refusing to set foot in that place again. I never told anyone what I saw that night. Who would believe me? But the memory of that figure, with its hollow eyes and ghostly presence, haunts me to this day. Sometimes, late at night, I still hear that faint whisper, like a voice calling to me from the darkness, and I wonder if the figure is still there, wandering the empty corridors of the warehouse, waiting for someone else to find it. It was a crisp autumn evening when I decided to call for a taxi. My car was in the shop for repairs, and I needed a ride to the other side of town. I was meeting some old friends for dinner, and the thought of navigating public transport didn't appeal to me. So I pulled out my phone and ordered a ride through the local taxi service app. Within minutes, the app notified me that a driver had accepted my request. The taxi would arrive in 5 minutes. I stepped outside, the cool breeze brushing against my face as I waited on the curb. The street lights had just flickered on, casting a warm, golden hue over the neighborhood. The air smelled of fallen leaves and distant wood smoke, the kind of night that made you want to sit by a fire with a good book. I heard the rumble of an engine before I saw the taxi. It turned the corner onto Maple Street and slowly made its way toward me. It was an older model, a boxy yellow sedan that had seen better days. The paint was chipped in places, and the car's headlights seemed dimmer than they should have been. Still, it was the ride I ordered, so I stepped forward as it pulled up beside me. The driver rolled down the passenger window and gave me a nod. He was an older man, perhaps in his late 50s or early 60s, with graying hair and a face etched with deep lines. His eyes were hidden behind a pair of dark sunglasses, which struck me as odd, considering it was already getting dark outside. But I didn't think much of it at the time. "You're heading to the downtown area, right?" he asked in a gravelly voice. I nodded and climbed into the back seat. The interior of the taxi was just as worn as the exterior. The seats were covered in faded, cracked leather, and the smell of stale tobacco lingered in the air. I buckled my seatbelt as the driver pulled away from the curb, and we began our journey through the quiet streets. At first, everything seemed normal. The driver didn't make small talk, which I appreciated. I wasn't in the mood for chit-chat. Instead, I stared out the window, watching the familiar landmarks of my neighborhood pass by. The ride was smooth, and I started to relax, my mind drifting to thoughts of the evening ahead. But as we left the residential area and entered the outskirts of downtown, something began to feel off. The driver took an unexpected turn, leading us down a narrow, poorly lit side street. I glanced at the app on my phone, which showed the route we should have been taking. We were now off course. "Excuse me," I said, leaning forward slightly. "I think you took a wrong turn. The app shows that we should be on Main Street." The driver didn't respond immediately. Instead, he kept his eyes on the road, his hands gripping the wheel tightly. "Don't worry," he finally said, his voice oddly calm. "I know a shortcut. We'll get there faster this way." Something about his tone made me uneasy. I wasn't familiar with the area we were in, and the buildings here were old and abandoned, their windows boarded up, and their walls covered in graffiti. The street was empty, not a soul in sight, and the street lights were few and far between. I felt a growing sense of unease in the pit of my stomach. "I'd prefer if we stuck to the main roads," I insisted, my voice firmer this time. The driver still didn't acknowledge my request. Instead, he made another turn, taking us deeper into the unfamiliar part of town. My unease turned to fear as I realized I was in a part of the city I'd never been to before. The app showed no streets matching our current location. It was as if we'd left the map altogether. I tried to keep calm, but my heart was racing. "Please," I said, my voice trembling slightly, "turn around. I want to go back." The driver finally spoke again, his voice low and almost mournful. "I can't turn around now." "We're almost there." "Almost where?" I demanded, but he didn't answer. Panic set in as the taxi turned down another desolate street, this one even darker and more foreboding than the last. I considered opening the door and jumping out, but the car was moving too fast. and I didn't know what kind of neighborhood I'd be stranded in if I did. Instead, I reached for my phone to call for help, but as I glanced at the screen, it went black. The battery had been at 60% just a moment ago, but now it was completely dead. I was trapped. The taxi slowed down as we approached a dead-end street flanked by crumbling buildings on either side. The headlights illuminated an old, rusted gate at the end of the road, behind which loomed a massive, decaying structure. It looked like an abandoned factory or warehouse, its windows shattered, and its walls covered in vines. The driver pulled to a stop in front of the gate and turned off the engine. Silence enveloped us, broken only by the distant sound of dripping water. My dream? But as I sat up, trying to calm my racing heart, I noticed something on the nightstand beside me. It was a pair of dark sunglasses, the same ones the driver had worn. I stared at them, my mind reeling, trying to make sense of it. How could they be here? It was just a dream, wasn't it? But deep down, I knew the truth. It hadn't been a dream. The haunted taxi of Maple Street was real, and I had been its latest passenger. And somewhere out there, that driver was still waiting, still searching for his next fare. The weekend camping trip was supposed to be a chance for me and my friends to get away from the grind, to unplug and reconnect with nature. We chose a spot deep in the forest, miles away from the nearest town, where the stars shone brighter and the air felt cleaner. It was the perfect escape, or so we thought. There were 4 of us, me, Jake, Emily, and Sarah. We had all been friends since college, and despite our busy lives, we made it a point to do something together at least once a year. This time, Jake suggested the camping trip, and we all agreed it was a great idea. We packed up our gear, loaded up the car, and set off for a weekend of hiking, fishing, and just enjoying each other's company around a campfire. The drive out to the campsite took us deep into the woods, down a narrow dirt road that twisted and turned through the trees. By the time we arrived, the sun was already low in the sky, casting long shadows across the clearing where we planned to set up camp. The place was beautiful, with tall pines towering overhead and a crystal-clear stream running nearby. We could hardly believe how peaceful and serene it was. We spent the evening setting up our tents, gathering firewood and cooking dinner over the fire. As the night fell, the temperature dropped, and we huddled closer to the flames, laughing and telling stories. It felt good to be out there, away from everything, with nothing but the sounds of the forest around us. But as the night wore on, something began to feel off. The forest, which had been alive with the sounds of crickets and rustling leaves, suddenly grew quiet, as if the woods themselves were holding their breath. The laughter died down, and we all sat in uneasy silence, staring into the fire. It was Jake who first mentioned the odd feeling. "Do you guys hear that?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. We all listened, but there was nothing to hear. The silence was deafening. "Maybe it's just the wind," Sarah suggested. Oh, her voice trembled slightly. We tried to shrug it off, but the uneasy feeling lingered. We decided to call it a night and head to our tents, hoping that sleep would come easily. But as I lay there, wrapped in my sleeping bag, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The silence pressed in on me, making it hard to breathe. Then, just as I was starting to drift off, I heard it. A scream. It was distant at first, barely audible over the rustling of the trees, but it was unmistakable. A high-pitched, blood-curdling scream that echoed through the forest, sending chills down my spine. I bolted upright, my heart pounding in my chest. The scream came again, louder this time, closer. It sounded like a woman, her voice filled with terror. As if she was running for her life, I scrambled out of my tent, and the others were already outside, wide-eyed and pale, their faces lit by the dim light of the dying campfire. "Did you hear that?" Emily asked, her voice trembling. "Yeah," Jake replied, his eyes scanning the darkness beyond the firelight. "We need to check it out." "Are you crazy?" Sarah hissed. "We should stay here and wait it out." But Jake was already grabbing a flashlight and heading towards the sound. Reluctantly, we followed, our footsteps crunching on the dry leaves as we ventured into the dark woods. The scream came again, louder, more desperate. We quickened our pace, our flashlights cutting through the darkness, but the trees seemed to close in around us, their twisted branches reaching out like skeletal hands. We followed the sound deeper into the woods, our hearts racing. But no matter how fast we ran, we couldn't seem to get any closer. The scream echoed through the trees, always just out of reach, leading us deeper and deeper into the forest. And then, just as suddenly as it started, the screaming stopped. We came to a halt, panting and disoriented, our flashlights flickering in the darkness. The silence returned, thicker and more oppressive than before. "We should go back," Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible. "We shouldn't be out here." But as we turned to head back to the campsite, something stopped us in our tracks. Standing just beyond the reach of our flashlights was a figure, tall and shadowy, barely more than a silhouette against the darkness. It didn't move, didn't make a sound, just stood there, watching us. We froze, too terrified to move or speak. The figure remained still, its presence chilling and unnatural. Then, without warning, it let out a scream so loud, so piercing, that it felt like it was tearing through our very souls. We clamped our hands over our ears, trying to block out the sound, but it was no use. The scream was inside our heads, rattling our bones, driving us to the brink of madness. And then, just as suddenly as it began, the scream stopped. The figure vanished, leaving us alone in the silent, empty woods. We ran. We ran faster than we ever had in our lives, not caring where we were going, just needing to get away from whatever that was. The trees blurred around us, the branches clawing at our clothes. But we didn't stop until we burst out of the woods and back into the clearing where our campsite lay. We didn't say a word as we packed up our gear, our hands shaking, our minds numb with fear. We left the campsite as quickly as we could, driving through the night, not daring to stop until we were miles away from those cursed woods. None of us spoke about what happened that night, not on the drive back and not in the days that followed. We went back to our lives, trying to forget the horror we had experienced, but the memory lingered, festering like an open wound. To this day, I can still hear that scream echoing through the woods, haunting my dreams. And I know deep down that something is still out there, something that was never meant to be found. I've been a trucker for over 20 years, driving long hauls across the country, but there's one trip that I'll never forget. It was about 5 years ago, in the dead of winter, when I was hauling a load of timber through the Pacific Northwest. The route took me through the mountains, where the roads were narrow, winding, and often treacherous. That night I was on Route 74, a remote stretch of road that cuts through dense forest. It was late, maybe around 1 a.m., and the snow was coming down hard, making it difficult to see more than a few feet in front of my headlights. The wind howled through the trees, rattling the cab of my truck as I navigated the icy roads. I was tired, but I couldn't afford to stop. The delivery was due the next morning, and I was already behind schedule. I kept my eyes on the road, trying to ignore the gnawing feeling of unease in my gut. Something about that night felt off, but I couldn't put my finger on it. I turned up the radio, hoping some music would drown out my nerves, but all I could find was static. The further I drove, the more isolated I felt. The road was empty, no other vehicles, no signs of life, just me, my truck, and the unrelenting snowstorm. After a while, I started noticing strange things. It began with shadows in the trees, dark shapes that seemed to move just out of the corner of my eye. I chalked it up to fatigue, thinking my mind was playing tricks on me. But then I saw something that made my blood run cold. As I rounded a bend in the road, my headlights caught something in the middle of the lane. At first I thought it was a fallen tree, but as I got closer, I realized it was something else entirely. Standing there, in the middle of the road, was a massive figure, easily over 8 feet tall, covered in thick, dark fur. Its arms were long, almost reaching the ground, and its eyes glowed with an eerie yellow light as they reflected the headlights. I slammed on the brakes, the tires skidding on the icy road as I tried to avoid hitting it. The truck came to a screeching halt just a few feet away from the creature. My heart pounded in my chest as I stared at it. Frozen in shock, it was no bear, I knew that much. This thing was different, more humanoid in its appearance, with a broad chest and muscular limbs. For a moment, it just stood there staring back at me through the windshield. Then, as if deciding I wasn't worth its time, it turned and lumbered off into the woods. I sat there for what felt like an eternity, too stunned to move. My hands shook as I gripped the steering wheel, my mind racing to make sense of what I had just seen. Was it Bigfoot? The thought seemed ridiculous, but what else could it have been? I'd heard stories from other truckers about strange sightings in these parts, but I'd always dismissed them as tall tales. Now I wasn't so sure. Finally, I managed to pull myself together and continued down the road, my eyes darting nervously between the trees. The rest of the trip was a blur, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. Every shadow, every rustle in the trees set my nerves on edge. When I finally reached my destination, I was exhausted, both physically and mentally. I parked the truck and stumbled into the nearest diner, needing a hot cup of coffee and a moment to collect myself. As I sat at the counter, staring blankly at the steam rising from my mug, I overheard a couple of locals talking at a nearby table. They were discussing the legend of Bigfoot, how there had been recent sightings in the area, and how people should be careful venturing into the woods. I couldn't believe it. Could what I had seen really have been Bigfoot? Part of me wanted to dismiss it as a hallucination brought on by fatigue and stress, but another part of me knew that what I saw was real. I never spoke about that night to anyone, not even my fellow truckers. What could I say that I saw Bigfoot while driving through a snowstorm? They'd laugh me right out of the truck stop. But the memory of that encounter stayed with me, haunting my thoughts every time I drove through the mountains. A few weeks later, I had another delivery that took me through the same route. I was nervous, to say the least, but I tried to push the fear aside. This time, though, I wasn't alone. I had a co-driver with me, a young guy named Dave, who was new to the job. We set out in the early afternoon, hoping to avoid driving through the mountains at night. The weather was clear, and the roads were in better condition than the last time I'd been through. As we drove, I kept my eyes peeled for any sign of the creature, but the trip was uneventful. We made good time and reached the mountains just as the sun was beginning to set. I felt a sense of relief as we started the descent, knowing that the worst part of the journey was behind us. But then, as we rounded a familiar bend in the road, I saw something that made my blood run cold. There, standing in the exact same spot where I had seen it before, was the creature. It was just as massive and imposing as I remembered its dark fur blending into the shadows of the trees. I slammed on the brakes, and Dave let out a startled yell as the truck skidded to a stop. "What the hell is that?" he shouted, his eyes wide with fear. "I don't know," I reply, my voice shaking. "But we need to get out of here." Now, the creature didn't move this time. It just stood there, watching us with those eerie yellow eyes. I didn't wait to see what it would do next. I threw the truck into reverse, backing up as quickly as I could without losing control on the icy road. Once we were a safe distance away, I turned the truck around and sped off in the opposite direction, not caring that it would add hours to our journey. We didn't stop until we were miles away, back in the safety of a well-lit rest area. Dave was visibly shaken, and I couldn't blame him. I was too. We sat in silence for a long time, trying to process what had just happened. "You think it was Bigfoot?" Dave finally asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I didn't know what to say. I wanted to tell him that it was just a bear, that we were both imagining things, but I couldn't lie. "I think so," I said, the words heavy in my mouth. "I think it was." We finished the rest of the trip in silence, both of us on edge to talk. When we finally reached our destination, I told the dispatcher that we needed to avoid Route 74 in the future, citing bad road conditions. I didn't mention the creature. Who would believe us anyway? After that, I made a point of avoiding that route whenever possible. I didn't want to risk another encounter, and I certainly didn't want to put anyone else in danger. But even now, years later, I can't shake the memory of those glowing yellow eyes staring at me through the darkness. Every time I drive through the mountains, I feel enough fear in my stomach, wondering if I'll see it again. I've heard other truckers talk about strange sightings on Route 74, but I've never told them about my own experience. What's the point? Some things are better left unsaid. But I know what I saw that night, and I'll carry that memory with me for the rest of my life. Bigfoot, or whatever it was, is out there in those woods, and I hope I never cross paths with it again. We had been hiking for hours, the dense forest canopy above us filtering the sunlight into eerie patterns on the ground. The forest was ancient, with trees so tall and thick that they seemed to touch the sky. The path we were following had long since been forgotten by most, overgrown with roots and shrubs, but Jake, our self-appointed guide, insisted that it was the quickest route to the summit. There were 5 of us, me, Jake, Sarah, Matt, and Liz. We were all seasoned hikers, used to the challenges of the wilderness, but something about this forest felt different. The air was thick with a strange, heavy silence, broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves or distant bird call. It was as if the forest was holding its breath, watching us as we made our way deeper into its heart. As the sun began to dip lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the forest floor, we decided to set up camp for the night. We found a small clearing surrounded by towering pines and started to pitch our tents. The atmosphere was tense, though no one wanted to admit it. We were all on edge, our eyes constantly darting to the shadows just beyond the firelight. After dinner, we sat around the fire, trying to shake off the uneasy feeling that had settled over us. Jake was the first to break the silence, telling one of his usual ghost stories in an attempt to lighten the mood. But instead of laughter, his story was met with nervous glances and forced smiles. The forest seemed to press in closer, the darkness just beyond our circle of light growing thicker, more oppressive. It was Matt who first noticed something was wrong. He had been staring into the fire, lost in thought, when he suddenly froze, his eyes wide with fear. "Did you see that?" he whispered, his voice trembling. We all turned to look in the direction he was staring, but there was nothing there, just the shadows of the trees swaying in the breeze. "See what?" Liz asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Matt shook his head, as if trying to shake off whatever he had seen. "I thought I saw ... something, a shadow, but it was moving too fast. It didn't look right." We all exchanged uneasy glances, the tension in the air thickening. "It's just your imagination," Jake said, trying to sound confident, but even he didn't seem convinced. We tried to laugh it off, to convince ourselves that it was just the darkness playing tricks on us. But the feeling of being watched only grew stronger. The shadows around us seemed to move, shifting and twisting in ways that didn't make sense. It was as if the darkness itself was alive, creeping closer with each passing moment. The wind began to pick up, rustling the leaves and causing the fire to flicker and dance. The shadows stretched and elongated, distorting into strange, almost humanoid shapes. We huddled closer to the fire, our eyes darting around the clearing, searching for something, anything that could explain the growing sense of dread. Then, without warning, the fire went out. We were plunged into darkness, the sudden silence pressing down on us like a weight. I could hear the others breathing heavily, their fear palpable in the air. My heart pounded in my chest as I fumbled for my flashlight, but when I clicked it on, the beam of light seemed feeble and weak, barely piercing the darkness, and that's when we saw them, figures, tall and thin, standing just beyond the reach of our lights. Their forms were indistinct, like shadows given shape and substance. They stood perfectly still, watching us with eyes that seemed to glow faintly in the dark. We were frozen in place, too terrified to move. The figures didn't approach, didn't make a sound, they just stood there, waiting. The air grew colder, the silence so thick it felt like it was choking us. Jake was the first to snap out of it. He grabbed his backpack and shouted for us to run. He didn't need to be told twice. We bolted from the clearing, stumbling over roots and rocks, the beams of our flashlights bouncing wildly as we ran. The figures didn't chase us, but I could feel their eyes on us, watching our every move. We ran until our lungs burned and our legs gave out, collapsing in a heap in a small, moonlit clearing far from our campsite. We didn't speak, didn't dare to look back. We just lay there, gasping for breath, our minds struggling to comprehend what we had seen. When we finally made it back to civilization the next morning, we were too shaken to talk about what had happened. We all agreed to leave the forest behind us, to never speak of it again. But the memory of those shadowy figures haunts me still, lurking in the corners of my mind, waiting to remind me that there are things in this world that we were never meant to understand. It was the night shift, the kind that always seemed to drag on forever. I had been driving my taxi for years, picking up all sorts of passengers, from late-night partygoers to exhausted workers heading home, but nothing could have prepared me for the ride I was about to take. I was parked on Maple Street, a quiet, narrow road lined with old Victorian houses. The street was eerily empty, not a soul in sight, which wasn't unusual for that time of night. I was about to call it a night when I saw a figure standing at the corner, waving me down. The man looked to be in his late 50s, dressed in a dark coat and hat, the kind you don't see much anymore. He had an air of old-world charm, like someone who had stepped out of a different era. As he approached, I noticed his eyes were a bit unsettling, cold, almost lifeless. But a fare was a fare, and I needed the money. He got into the back seat and quietly gave me an address, somewhere on the other side of town. His voice was low and monotone, and there was something about it that made my skin crawl. I couldn't quite put my finger on it, but there was definitely something off about this guy. I started driving, trying to shake off the uneasy feeling creeping up my spine. The roads were empty, save for the occasional stray cat or a flickering street light. The silence in the cab was heavy, oppressive, and I found myself glancing at the rearview mirror more than I normally would. The man just sat there, staring straight ahead, not moving a muscle. I tried to make small talk, asking him how his night was going, but he didn't respond. He didn't even acknowledge that I'd spoken. That's when I noticed something strange in the mirror. His reflection was faint, almost transparent. I blinked, thinking it was a trick of the light or maybe I was just tired. But no, the more I looked, the more I realized that the man's reflection was barely there. It was like he wasn't fully solid, like he didn't really belong in this world. My heart started to race, but I kept driving, unsure of what else to do. The address he gave me was on the outskirts of town, and a part of the city I wasn't too familiar with. The streets became narrower, the houses more dilapidated, and the street lights fewer and farther between. I could feel the temperature drop inside the cab, a chill that settled deep in my bones. I finally reached the address, a large, decaying mansion that looked like it hadn't been lived in for decades. The windows were broken, the paint peeling, and the yard overgrown with weeds. There was no way anyone lived there. I turned around to tell the man we'd arrived, but the back seat was empty. My heart nearly stopped. I had heard no door open, no sound of him getting out. He was just gone. I sat there, frozen, trying to process what had just happened. The cab was empty, but the seat where he had been sitting was ice cold, like he had left a part of himself behind. I wanted to leave, to get away from that place as fast as I could, but something compelled me to stay. I looked at the house again, and for a brief moment I thought I saw someone standing in one of the upstairs windows. But when I blinked, the figure was gone. I finally snapped out of it and drove off, my hands shaking as I gripped the steering wheel. The streets blurred past me as I tried to put as much distance as possible between me and that cursed house. I didn't stop until I was back in the city, surrounded by the comforting glow of street lights and the distant hum of traffic. I pulled over to the side of the road and took a few deep breaths, trying to calm my racing heart. It had to be a prank, I told myself. Or maybe I was just tired, imagining things, but deep down I knew that wasn't true. I drove back to Maple Street the next night, hoping to find some explanation for what had happened. I parked in the same spot and waited, my eyes scanning the corner where I had picked up the man, but there was no sign of him. I asked around, talked to some of the neighbors, but no one had seen a man fitting his description. One of the older residents mentioned that the house I had driven to was once owned by a wealthy family who had all died in a tragic fire many years ago. The place had been abandoned ever since. The more I thought about it, the more it made sense. If that man had been one of them, maybe he was just trying to go home. I've had a lot of passengers over the years, but that man was the only one who left me questioning my sanity. Every time I drive down Maple Street now, I feel a chill run down my spine, and I can't help but glance at that corner, half expecting to see him standing there again, waiting for a ride home that he'll never get. I still remember the day it all started. It was a crisp autumn afternoon, and the sun hung low in the sky, casting a golden glow over the fields that surrounded our old farmhouse. My sister, Lily, and I were playing in the yard, as we had done countless times before. The air was cool, the leaves crunched underfoot, and everything seemed perfectly normal until it wasn't. Lily was only 13 at the time, 2 years younger than me. She was always the lively one, with a laugh that could light up a room and a smile that was infectious. That day, she was chasing me around the yard, her long brown hair streaming behind her as she ran. We were playing tag, our breath coming out in puffs of white in the chilly air. It was just another day, or so I thought. We were halfway through the game when Lily suddenly stopped in her tracks. She stood still, her gaze fixed on something in the distance. I followed her line of sight, expecting to see a deer or maybe a stray dog, but there was nothing there, just the old oak tree at the edge of the yard, its branches swaying gently in the breeze. Lily. I called out, but she didn't respond. She just stood there, staring at the tree as if she were in a trance. I walked over to her, waving a hand in front of her face. "Hey, Earth," to Lily. She blinked and shook her head as if snapping out of a dream. "Did you see that?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "See what?" I asked, feeling a twinge of unease. "There was someone standing by the tree," she said, her eyes wide. "A man, I think, but he was different." I frowned and looked back at the tree. "There was no one there. You must be imagining things," I said, trying to sound reassuring. "There's no one there." But Lily wasn't convinced. She kept staring at the tree, her brow furrowed in concentration. I tried to get her to play again, but she was distant, distracted, as if her mind was somewhere else. Eventually we gave up and went inside for dinner, but that was only the beginning. Over the next few days, Lily started acting strange. She was quieter than usual, her lively spirit dampened by something I couldn't quite put my finger on. She spent more and more time alone, often staring out the window at the old oak tree. When I asked her what was wrong, she would just shake her head and say, "Nothing." But it wasn't nothing. It was far from nothing. One night, I was woken up by the sound of footsteps in the hallway. I gradually looked at the clock. It was 3 a.m. I got out of bed and opened my door, expecting to see my mom or dad heading to the bathroom. But instead I saw Lily. She was standing in the hallway, her back to me, her head tilted slightly to the side. "Lily," I whispered, but she didn't respond. I walked up to her, gently placing a hand on her shoulder. "Lily, what are you doing?" She slowly turned to face me, and what I saw made my blood run cold. Her eyes were wide, but they didn't seem to see me. They were glazed over, distant, as if she were looking at something far beyond me. Her skin was pale, almost ghostly, and her lips were moving, though no sound was coming out. "Lily, you're scaring me," I said, my voice trembling. She blinked, and suddenly it was as if a switch had been flipped. She shook her head and looked at me, her eyes focusing. "What are you doing up?" she asked, her voice back to normal. "I should be asking you that," I replied, my heart still pounding. "You were sleepwalking or something," she frowned, clearly confused. I don't remember getting up. I didn't know what to say. Lily had never sleepwalked before, and the whole thing was unsettling to say the least. I walked her back to her room and made sure she was tucked in before heading back to bed myself. But sleep didn't come easily. I couldn't shake the image of her vacant eyes staring right through me. The next day, I told my parents about what had happened, but they brushed it off as just a weird dream or stress from school. They didn't see what I saw. They didn't know what I knew. Something was wrong with Lily, and it was getting worse. In the days that followed, the strange incidents became more frequent. Lily would zone out in the middle of conversations, her eyes glazing over like they had that night. She started talking to herself, whispering under her breath, as if she were having a conversation with someone who wasn't there. She would wake up in strange places, in the attic, in the basement, even outside, standing barefoot in the yard in the dead of night. My parents grew concerned, but they still didn't understand the gravity of the situation. They took her to the doctor, who said it was probably just stress or a sleep disorder. He prescribed some medication, but it didn't help. If anything, it made things worse. One night, about a week after the sleepwalking incident, I was woken up again by a strange sound. It wasn't footsteps. This time it was a low, guttural growl, like the sound an animal makes when it's cornered. I sat up in bed, my heart racing, and listened. The growling was coming from Lily's room. I jumped out of bed and ran to her room, throwing the door open. What I saw made my stomach turn. Lily was on her bed, her body twisted in an unnatural position. Her back was arched, her head thrown back, and her mouth was open wide, emitting that terrible growl. Her eyes were rolled back into her head, and her hands were clawing at the air as if she were trying to fend off something invisible. "Lily," I screamed, rushing to her side. I shook her, trying to wake her up, but she didn't respond. Her body convulsed, and the growling grew louder, more feral. I screamed for my parents, who came running in, their faces pale with fear. "What's happening to her?" my mom cried, trying to hold Lily down as she thrashed on the bed. My dad was already on the phone, calling 911. But I knew it was too late. Whatever was happening to Lily, it was beyond anything the doctors could help with. The paramedics arrived quickly, and they took Lily to the hospital, but the doctors were baffled. They ran tests, checked for seizures, for infections, for anything that could explain her condition, but they found nothing. They kept her in the hospital for observation, but the growling and convulsions continued, and her mental state deteriorated rapidly. It was as if something was taking over her, something dark and malevolent that we couldn't see or understand. She stopped speaking, stopped recognizing us. She would sit in her hospital bed, staring at the wall, her lips moving silently as if she were communicating with something only she could see. My parents were beside themselves with worrying, but I knew deep down, I knew this wasn't something that could be fixed with medicine or therapy. This was something else, something that had latched onto Lily that day in the yard, something that was slowly consuming her. One night I stayed at the hospital with her, refusing to leave her side. I sat in the chair by her bed, watching her sleep, my heart heavy with fear and guilt. I felt like I had failed her, like I should have done something sooner, should have known what was happening. Around midnight, the room grew colder, and the lights flickered. I looked around, my skin prickling with unease, and then I heard Ida whisper, soft and faint, like the rustle of leaves in the wind. Lily. I stiffened, my breath catching in my throat. The whisper came again, closer this time, more insistent. Lily. I stood up, my eyes scanning the room. There was no one there, just me and Lily, and the shadows that seemed to creep closer with every passing second. "Lily, wake up," I whispered, shaking her gently, but she didn't stir. Her breathing was shallow, her skin pale and cold, and then, in the darkness, I saw it, a figure standing at the foot of her bed, barely more than a shadow. It was tall and thin, its face obscured by the darkness, but I could feel its eyes on me, watching me with a malevolent intensity. "Lily, please wake up," I pleaded, my voice trembling. I reached out to shake her again, but my hand froze in midair. The figure was moving, slowly, deliberately, toward her. Its hand, if you could call it that, reached out, its fingers long and bony, tipped with claws that gleamed in the dim light. "No," I screamed, throwing myself in front of Lily, but it was too late. The figure's hand passed through me as if I weren't even there, and it touched Lily's forehead, its claws sinking into her skin. Lily gasped, her eyes snapping open. But they weren't her eyes anymore. They were black, completely devoid of any color, any humanity. She stared at me, her mouth twisting into a grotesque smile. "Lily?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. But it wasn't Lily who answered. "She's mine now," the thing inside her said, its voice low and guttural, echoing with an unnatural resonance. I stumbled back, my heart racing, my mind reeling. This couldn't be happening, it couldn't be real. But it was. I could see it in her eyes, hear it in her voice. My sister was gone, taken by something dark and evil that I couldn't even begin to comprehend. The doctors came running in, alerted by my screams, but they couldn't do anything. They tried to restrain her, but she fought them with a strength that wasn't hers. They sedated her, but even then I could see it, the thing inside her, watching me, mocking me. That was the last time I saw Lily. The doctors transferred her to a psychiatric facility, but I knew it was pointless. Whatever had taken her, it wasn't something that could be cured by medicine or therapy. It was something ancient, something evil, something that had marked her as its own. I spent years trying to forget, trying to move on, but the memories haunt me. I can still hear her voice in my nightmares, still see her eyes, black and soulless, staring back at me. I still hear that growl, that low, guttural sound that chills me to the bone. I don't know where she is now, or if she's even still alive. But I do know one thing: whatever took her, it's still out there, and I'm afraid it's only a matter of time before it comes back for me. It was supposed to be a simple weekend hike through the Appalachian Mountains. I've always loved the outdoors, the fresh air, the challenge of the terrain, and the peace that comes with being surrounded by nature. So when my buddy Jake suggested we tackle a new trail he'd heard about, I was all in. The trail was off the beaten path, not one of the more popular routes, but that was part of the appeal. We packed our gear, stocked up on supplies, and hit the road early on a Saturday morning, eager to get a head start. The drive was long, but the views were stunning. By the time we arrived at the trailhead, the sun was already high in the sky, casting long shadows through the dense forest. We checked our maps, made sure we had everything we needed, and set off into the wilderness. The trail started off easy enough, winding through a grove of ancient trees, their branches forming a natural canopy overhead. The air was cool, filled with the scent of pine and earth, and the only sounds were the crunch of leaves underfoot and the distant call of birds. It was perfect. About an hour into the hike, we came across something strange. The trail split into two, but only one path was marked on the map. The other seemed to lead deeper into the forest, its entrance partially obscured by overgrown bushes. Jake, always the adventurous one, suggested we take the unmarked path. It could be a shortcut, he said, a grin spreading across his face. Or maybe it leads to something cool that's not on the map. I was hesitant, but curiosity got the better of me, so we agreed to check it out. The path was narrow and winding, the trees growing thicker the further we went. It wasn't long before we stumbled upon an old, weathered signpost, the writing barely legible. Beware, it read, "Trespassers will be cursed." Jake laughed it off, but I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that had settled in the pit of my stomach. Something about the sign felt wrong, like it was a warning we shouldn't ignore. But Jake was already moving ahead, and I didn't want to be left behind, so I followed him. The path led us to a small clearing, and at the center of it was an ancient stone altar, covered in moss and vines. On the altar lay a small, intricately carved box, its surface adorned with strange symbols that I didn't recognize. Jake, always the thrill-seeker, walked right up to it and picked it up, turning it over in his hands. "This thing is awesome," he said, clearly excited. "I wonder what's inside." I told him to put it back, that we shouldn't mess with things we didn't understand, but he just shrugged me off. He pried open the box, and inside was a small metal pendant on a frayed cord. The pendant was shaped like a twisted figure, almost humanoid, but with elongated limbs and a face that seemed to be frozen in a silent scream. The moment Jake touched the pendant, I felt a cold breeze sweep through the clearing, even though the air had been still moments before. The trees around us seemed to close in, their branches creaking and groaning as if they were alive. "Jake, we need to leave," I said, my voice trembling. But he just waved me off, more fascinated by the pendant and by the strange atmosphere that had descended on us. He slipped the cord over his neck, and that's when everything went wrong. The sky, which had been clear and bright, suddenly darkened, and the air grew thick with an oppressive heaviness. The forest, once alive with the sounds of nature, fell deathly silent. It was as if the world itself was holding its breath. Jake started to sway on his feet, his eyes rolling back in his head. I rushed over to him, grabbing his shoulders, but he was ice cold to the touch. Jake, snap out of it," I shouted, but he didn't respond. His body convulsed, and he collapsed to the ground, unconscious. I frantically tried to wake him, but he was unresponsive. The pendant around his neck seemed to pulse with an unnatural energy, glowing faintly in the dim light. I knew we had to get out of there, but I couldn't leave Jake behind. With all the strength I could muster, I hoisted him onto my shoulders and started back the way we had come. The forest seemed to have changed, the path twisting and turning in ways it hadn't before. Every step felt like a struggle, as if the very ground beneath my feet was trying to drag me down. I could hear whispers all around me, voices that seemed to come from the trees themselves, speaking in a language I didn't understand. The air was thick with the smell of decay, and the shadows seemed to move, closing in on us from all sides. I didn't know how long I walked, but it felt like hours, maybe even days. My muscles burned and my lungs screamed for air, but I couldn't stop. I had to keep going, had to get Jake to safety. Finally, I broke through the tree line and stumbled back onto the main trail. The moment I did, the oppressive feeling lifted, and the world seemed to snap back to normal. The sky was clear again, and the sounds of the forest returned as if nothing had happened. I laid Jake down and checked for a pulse. It was weak, but it was there. Relief washed over me, and I called for help on my satellite phone. Rescue teams arrived within an hour, and they airlifted Jake to the nearest hospital. I went with him, unable to shake the feeling that we had just escaped something far worse than we could comprehend. Jake was in a coma for 3 days. The doctors couldn't explain what had happened to him, but I knew it had something to do with that cursed pendant. When he finally woke up, he didn't remember anything about the hike or the pendant, but he wasn't the same. He was quieter, more withdrawn, and there was a haunted look in his eyes that never seemed to go away. I tried to forget what had happened, but the memory of that day lingered like a dark cloud over my mind. I haven't been back to the mountains since, and I don't think I ever will. Some things are better left untouched, and some paths are better left untraveled. The pendant, the cursed relic that started it all, was never found. The rescue team didn't see it when they found us, and I never saw it again. But sometimes in the dead of night I can still hear the whispers, faint and distant, calling out from the darkness. I don't know what they want, and I don't want to find out. All I know is that we were lucky to get out of there alive, and I'll never forget the lesson I learned that day. Some mysteries are better left unsolved, and some curses are better left alone. It was supposed to be just another night, another quiet shift in a job that paid little but offered the peace I'd been craving. I'd been working as a night security guard at the old Metro storage warehouse for about 6 months. The building was a massive, sprawling structure with rows upon rows of shelves stacked high with everything from office supplies to old furniture. It wasn't glamorous work, but it was easy money. My job was simple. Walk the perimeter, check the doors, make sure nothing was out of place, and most nights that was exactly what I did. I'd grab a cup of coffee from the break room, do my rounds, and then settle in the security desk, where I'd pass the time reading or watching videos on my phone. The warehouse was quiet at night, almost eerily so. The kind of quiet that made you acutely aware of every creak, every distant hum of machinery, every rustle of the wind against the metal walls. But I got used to it. I learned to ignore the strange noises that echoed through the vast, empty space, convincing myself they were just the building settling or a draft blowing through one of the many nooks and crannies. But there was one night I'll never forget. A night when the usual quiet became something more, something dark, something that still sends shivers down my spine every time I think about it. It started out like any other shift. I arrived at the warehouse at 10 p.m., greeted the day shift guard as he clocked out, and took my usual seat at the security desk. I spent the first hour of my shift scrolling through my phone, sipping on a cup of lukewarm coffee, and occasionally glancing at the security monitors. Nothing out of the ordinary, just the usual flickering images of empty corridors and silent storage rooms. At around midnight, I decided to do my first round of the night. I grabbed my flashlight, clipped my radio to my belt, and headed out into the dimly lit expanse of the warehouse. The air inside was cool, almost chilly, and the fluorescent lights cast long, ominous shadows that seemed to dance and shift with every step I took. But again, this was nothing new. I'd done this walk hundreds of times, and nothing had ever happened. I started at the north end of the building, checking the main entrance and the loading docks. Everything was secure. As expected, I made my way down the long central corridor, my footsteps echoing off the concrete floor, the sound amplified in the stillness. As I walked, I felt the familiar sensation of being watched, an uneasy feeling that crept up my spine and made the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. But I shrugged it off. It was just my imagination, I told myself. Just the effects of too many late nights and too little sleep. I continued my rounds, checking each storage room and office as I went. The building was a labyrinth of narrow passageways and endless rows of shelves, all bathed in the sickly yellow glow of the overhead lights. The deeper I went into the warehouse, the quieter it became, until all I could hear was the sound of my own breathing and the soft thud of my boots on the floor. I was about halfway through my round when I noticed something odd. One of the storage rooms, room 3B, had its door slightly ajar. I frowned. I was certain I had locked that door when I did my round at the start of my shift. It was one of the rooms that held sensitive materials, documents, and records that needed to be kept secure. I approached the door cautiously, my hand instinctively reaching for the flashlight at my side. I pushed the door open with my foot, shining the light into the room. It was empty, just the usual rows of shelves lined with boxes and files. But something didn't feel right. The air in the room was colder than the rest of the warehouse, and there was a strange, musty smell that I hadn't noticed before. I stepped inside, sweeping the beam of my flashlight across the room. Everything seemed to be in place, but that nagging feeling of unease wouldn't go away. I walked to the back of the room, checking the shelves and making sure nothing had been disturbed. As I reached the far corner, I heard a soft rustling sound, like the pages of a book being turned. I froze, every muscle in my body tensing. The sound was faint, barely audible, but it was there. I slowly turned, shining my flashlight in the direction of the noise. The beam illuminated a stack of boxes, each labeled with neat, precise handwriting. I took a step closer, my heart pounding in my chest taut, and then I saw it. A shadow, dark and indistinct, flitting across the wall at the edge of my flashlight's beam. It was quick, almost too quick to be seen, but it was there. I jerked the light in its direction, but there was nothing, just the empty wall and the stacks of boxes. I took a deep breath, trying to calm my nerves. It was probably just a trick of the light, I told myself. Just my tired eyes playing tricks on me. But as I turned to leave the room, I heard it again, the rustling, closer this time, more insistent, and then a whisper, faint, barely more than a breath, but unmistakable. "Get out." The voice was cold, emotionless, and it sent a jolt of fear through me. I spun around, my flashlight sweeping the room, but there was nothing, no one, just the empty shelves and the suffocating silence. I backed out of the room, my heart racing, my mind struggling to make sense of what I had just heard. I slammed the door shut and quickly locked it, my hands shaking. I didn't know what was happening, but I knew I didn't want to stay in that room any longer. I hurried back to the security desk, my nerves on edge, my mind racing with thoughts of what I had just experienced. I tried to convince myself it was nothing, just the wind or maybe a rodent scurrying through the walls. But deep down, I knew it was something more, something I couldn't explain. For the rest of the night, I stayed at the security desk, my eyes glued to the monitors, my ears straining to catch any sound, but the warehouse was silent, eerily so. I finished my shift without incident, but the unease lingered long after I had left the building. Over the next few nights, the strange occurrences became more frequent. Doors that I knew I had locked would be found open. Items would be moved, sometimes disappearing altogether, and always there was that feeling of being watched, of something unseen lurking in the shadows, just out of sight. One night, about a week after the first incident, I was doing my rounds when I heard footsteps behind me. They were slow, deliberate, echoing in the quiet of the warehouse. I stopped, turning quickly, but there was no one there. The corridor was empty. The only sound the faint hum of the overhead lights, but the footsteps continued. They were getting closer, the sound growing louder, more distinct. I backed away, my flashlight trembling in my hand. The footsteps stopped, but the feeling of being watched grew stronger, more oppressive, and then I saw it. A shadow, darker than the others, standing at the far end of the corridor. It was tall, its form vaguely human, but there was something wrong about it, something twisted, unnatural. It didn't move, just stood there, watching me with eyes that I couldn't see but could feel. I wanted to run, to get as far away from that place as possible, but my feet were rooted to the spot. I could feel the air growing colder, the lights flickering as the shadows slowly started to move toward me. "Leave now," a voice whispered in my ear, the same cold, emotionless voice I had heard in the storage room. "Leave, or you'll never leave." I didn't need to be told twice. I turned and ran, my footsteps echoing in the corridor as I sprinted back to the security desk. I grabbed my jacket, my keys, and didn't look back as I bolted out of the warehouse, the door slamming shut behind me. I quit the next day. I didn't give a reason, just handed in my resignation and walked away from that place for good. But the memory of those nights still haunts me. The image of that shadow burned into my mind. I don't know what it was that I encountered in that warehouse. But I know one thing: I was lucky to get out when I did. I've tried to move on, to forget about what happened, but it's not easy. Every time I close my eyes, I see that shadow, feel its eyes on me, hear the whisper in my ear. And sometimes, late at night, when the world is quiet and I'm alone in the dark, I wonder if it's still out there, waiting for me to let my guard down. Because deep down, I know I escaped that night, but the shadow, the thing that stalked me in that warehouse, it's still out there. And one day, it might just come back for me. The first day I set foot in Hillcrest Hospital, I knew something wasn't right. It wasn't just the age of the building, or the way the shadows seemed to linger in the hallways longer than they should. There was a heaviness in the air, a feeling like the walls themselves were holding on to secrets too terrible to share. But as a new nurse fresh out of school, I chalked it up to nerves and the overwhelming responsibility of the job. The hospital had a reputation for being haunted, but most of the staff laughed it off as urban legend. I wasn't so sure. I'd been assigned to the night shift in the psychiatric wing, the one part of the hospital that even the most seasoned nurses didn't like to talk about. It was the kind of place where the lights never seemed to be bright enough, where the silence felt more like a warning than a reprieve. My first few nights were uneventful, mostly spent getting to know the routines and the patients. There were the usual cases: depression, anxiety, schizophrenia, but one patient stood out from the rest. Her name was Evelyn, a woman in her late 60s with a history of severe delusions and violent outbursts. The other nurses warned me to keep my distance, but I couldn't help but feel sorry for her. She was alone with no family or friends to visit, and the sadness in her eyes was impossible to ignore. Evelyn's room was at the end of the hall, the furthest from the nurse's station. Every time I approached her door, I felt a cold draft, as if the temperature dropped the closer I got. Her room was always dim, the shadows in the corners darker than they had any right to be, and Evelyn would sit in the middle of her bed, rocking back and forth, whispering to herself. I never understood what she was saying, but I could tell she was terrified. She'd stare at the walls, her eyes wide with fear, as if she was seeing something the rest of us couldn't. One night, after a particularly quiet shift, I decided to check on Evelyn one last time before my break. As I reached her door, I heard her whispering, her voice frantic. I knocked softly before entering, but she didn't seem to notice me. She was staring at the far wall, her eyes wild, her hands clutching the bed sheet so tightly her knuckles were white. "Evelyn," I called gently, stepping closer. Her eyes darted to me, and for a moment I saw pure terror in them. She started to scream, a sound so piercing and filled with anguish that it sent chills down my spine. I rushed to her side, trying to calm her down, but she kept screaming, pointing at the wall, her words incoherent. I glanced at the wall, expecting to see nothing, but there was something there, something that made my blood run cold. The shadows on the wall, they were moving. At first I thought it was a trick of the light, maybe caused by the flickering bulb in the hallway. But no, these shadows had form and substance. They writhed and twisted, reaching out as if trying to pull themselves free from the wall. And then I saw faces in those shadows, distorted, anguished faces, mouths open in silent screams. My heart pounded in my chest as I pulled Evelyn away from the wall, trying to shield her from whatever was happening. She clung to me, her screams turning to sobs, and I could feel her body shaking uncontrollably. The room felt colder than ever, and the shadows on the wall grew darker, more solid. I fumbled for the call button, my hands trembling, but before I could press it, the shadows receded, melting back into the wall as if they'd never been there. The temperature in the room returned to normal, and Evelyn's sobs slowly quieted. She was still trembling, but the sheer terror in her eyes had faded to a dull, exhausted fear. I stayed with her until she finally fell asleep, my mind racing with what I had just seen. I wanted to believe it was a hallucination, maybe a result of working too many night shifts, but deep down I knew that wasn't the case. The next day I told the head nurse what had happened. She looked at me with a mix of concern and skepticism, but she didn't dismiss my story. Instead, she pulled me aside and told me something I'll never forget. "You're not the first to see them," she said quietly, "but it's best not to talk about it. Hillcrest has a history, and some things are better left in the past." She didn't say anything more, but I could see in her eyes that she knew more than she was letting on. The other nurses, too, seemed to avoid the topic whenever it came up. It was like an unspoken rule: don't talk about the shadows, don't acknowledge them, and maybe, just maybe, they'll leave you alone. But they didn't leave me alone. Over the next few weeks, the shadows became more frequent. I'd catch glimpses of them out of the corner of my eye, slithering along the walls, lurking in the corners of the rooms. The patients, especially the ones in the psychiatric wing, became more agitated, more fearful, as if they could sense the darkness that was closing in on them. Evelyn's condition worsened. She stopped talking, stopped eating, and spent her days huddled in the corner of her bed, eyes wide with fear. The doctors didn't know what to do, and the medication they gave her seemed to have no effect. One night, as I was making my rounds, I heard a commotion coming from Evelyn's room. I rushed to her door, dreading what I might find. When I opened the door, the sight that greeted me was like something out of a nightmare. Evelyn was standing in the middle of the room, her eyes rolled back in her head, her mouth moving as if she was speaking, but no sound came out. The shadows were all around her, swirling and writhing, almost as if they were alive. And then they started to close in on her. I ran towards her, but it was like moving through molasses. The air was thick and heavy, and every step felt like a struggle. The shadows wrapped around Evelyn, pulling her towards the wall. She didn't scream, didn't fight back. She just stood there, as if resigned to her fate. I reached out to grab her, to pull her away from whatever was happening, but it was too late. The shadows engulfed her, and she disappeared into the wall. I stood there, staring at the spot where she had just been, my mind struggling to comprehend what I had just witnessed. The room was silent, the shadows gone, but the cold, oppressive feeling remained. I never saw Evelyn again. The official report said she had a psychotic break and wandered off into the night, but I knew the truth. The shadows had taken her, just like they had taken others before her. I transferred out of Hillcrest Hospital not long after that. I couldn't stay there, not with the memories of what I had seen, what I had lost. But even now, years later, I can't escape the feeling that they're still out there, lurking in the dark corners of forgotten places, waiting for the next unfortunate soul to stumble across them. And sometimes, when I'm alone in the dark, I can still see them, those writhing, twisted shadows, and the faces of those they've claimed, trapped forever in a place where the light can't reach. The summer before my senior year in college, I decided to take a solo camping trip. I had always been a bit of a loner, enjoying the peace and solitude that nature offered. Red Rock Woods, a dense forest known for its towering pines and deep, hidden valleys, seemed like the perfect place to escape the stress of city life. I packed my gear, loaded up my old Jeep, and set off early in the morning, eager for a weekend of peace and quiet. The drive took about 3 hours, winding through the countryside before finally reaching the edge of the forest. The entrance to Red Rock Woods was marked by a small, weathered sign that creaked in the wind. I pulled into the gravel parking lot, noting the lack of other vehicles. It was early in the season, and I figured most people were still waiting for the peak of summer before heading out to the woods. That was fine by me. I preferred the isolation. I grabbed my backpack and headed down the narrow trail that led into the heart of the forest. The path was well worn, but the dense undergrowth on either side seemed to close in on me as I walked deeper into the woods. The air was cool and damp, the smell of pine and earth filling my lungs. The only sounds were the crunch of leaves beneath my boots and the occasional rustle of animals in the bushes. After about an hour of hiking, I reached a small clearing near a babbling creek. It was the perfect spot to set up camp. I pitched my tent, gathered some firewood, and set about making a small fire. As the flames crackled and popped, I sat back and took in the serenity of the place. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the clearing. I felt a sense of contentment that I hadn't experienced in a long time, but as the darkness grew, so did a feeling of unease. It started as a subtle sense that something was watching me, hidden in the trees just beyond the light of the fire. I tried to shake it off, telling myself it was just my imagination playing tricks on me, but the feeling persisted, growing stronger with each passing minute. I tried to distract myself by cooking dinner, but every time I looked up from the fire, I could have sworn I saw movement in the shadows. A quick, fleeting glimpse of something large and dark moving between the trees. My heart began to race, and I found myself constantly glancing over my shoulder, straining to see into the inky blackness beyond the FIRELIGHT. As the night wore on, the forest seemed to come alive with sounds, branches snapping, leaves rustling, the distant cry of some unknown animal. But these were not the usual sounds of the woods. They were deliberate, calculated, as if something was stalking me, toying with me. I tried to convince myself it was just a bear or a deer, curious about the fire. But deep down, I knew it was something else, something that didn't belong in these woods, something that was watching me with malicious intent. Around midnight, the noises stopped. The silence was sudden and absolute, as if the entire forest was holding its breath. I sat by the fire, gripping my hunting knife, my eyes darting from shadow to shadow, waiting for something, anything to happen. When we first saw the house, it seemed like a dream come true, nestled at the end of a long, winding dirt road, surrounded by thick woods and a babbling creek. Hollow Creek House was everything we'd ever wanted, a place to raise our kids, far from the chaos of the city, where the air was clean and the nights were quiet. The real estate agent had been a bit vague about the house's history, but the price was right, and we were eager to leave the hustle and bustle behind. We didn't question why such a beautiful property had been on the market for so long. In hindsight, we should have. Moving day was hectic, but we finally got everything inside and settled down for our first night in our new home. The kids, Ella and Josh, were excited, racing from room to room, exploring every nook and cranny. My wife, Sarah, and I were exhausted but happy, thrilled to be starting this new chapter in our lives. The first few nights passed without incident. The house was old, and it creaked and groaned as it settled, but that was to be expected. We spent our days unpacking and getting to know the property, exploring the woods, and finding new places to play by the creek. It was idyllic, like something out of a storybook. But then strange things began to happen. It started small doors that we knew we had closed would be found open, lights flickering even though the bulbs were brand new, and a persistent feeling of being watched, especially at night. The kids started waking up in the middle of the night, complaining of bad dreams. Ella, our youngest, said she kept seeing a shadowy figure standing in the corner of her room. We chalked it up to the stress of the move, reassuring her that it was just her imagination. But the more we reassured her, the more insistent she became. Josh, too, started to complain about the house. He said he didn't like going down to the basement because it felt weird. I couldn't argue with him. There was something about that basement that made my skin crawl. It was cold and damp, even in the middle of summer, and the air felt thick, like it was pressing down on you. But I told him not to worry, that there was nothing down there but old pipes and dusty boxes. Then, one night, Sarah and I were awoken by a loud crash from downstairs. We rushed down to find the kitchen in disarray, cabinets flung open, dishes shattered on the floor, and a cold breeze blowing through the room. The back door was wide open, swinging gently on its hinges. I checked every window and door, but there was no sign of forced entry, no sign that anyone had been there but us. We were rattled, but we tried to stay calm, telling ourselves it was just the wind or maybe an animal that had somehow gotten inside. But deep down, we both knew something was wrong. The activity in the house escalated quickly after that. Shadows flitted through the corners of our vision, low whispers that seemed to come from nowhere, and the feeling that we were never truly alone. The children's nightmares became more frequent, and Ella's insistence that she was seeing someone in her room grew more desperate. We were on edge, snapping at each other, our nerves frayed by the constant tension. One evening I was outside chopping wood when I saw something that made my blood run cold. Standing at the edge of the woods, just beyond the creek, was a figure, a tall, thin man in what looked like old-fashioned clothing. He was just standing there, staring at me, his face hidden in shadow. I dropped the axe and called out to him, but he didn't move, didn't react in any way. My heart pounded as I took a step forward, and that's when he disappeared, fading into the trees like a wisp of smoke. I stood there, frozen, my mind racing to make sense of what I had just seen. I didn't tell Sarah about it. I didn't want to scare her more than she already was. But that night, as we sat in the living room, I could tell she knew something was wrong. There was a heaviness in the air, a feeling like we were being watched from the shadows just beyond the firelight. That's when the smell started. It was faint at first, like something rotten, something decaying, wafting through the house. We searched everywhere but couldn't find the source. The smell grew stronger each day, until it permeated every room, making it nearly impossible to stay inside. The kids refused to sleep in their rooms, and I didn't blame them. We all started sleeping in the living room, the only place where the smell wasn't as strong, huddled together on the couch. One night, as we lay there in the dark, I heard the sound of footsteps on the stairs, slow, deliberate, getting closer and closer. My heart raced as I sat up, listening, straining to see in the dim light. The footsteps stopped at the top of the stairs, just outside the living room. I held my breath, waiting, but there was nothing, just silence. I don't know what possessed me, but I got up and crept towards the stairs, my breath coming in short, shallow gasps. I peered up into the darkness, and there, at the top of the stairs, was the figure, the same one I had seen by the creek. He was closer now, and I could see his face a twisted, grotesque mask of rage and pain. He opened his mouth, and a low, guttural sound filled the air, a sound that made my blood run cold. I stumbled back, nearly falling as I scrambled to get away, but when I looked again, he was gone. The next day I called a priest. I didn't care if it sounded crazy. I was desperate. The priest arrived that afternoon, an older man with a kind face and a calm demeanor. He listened as I told him everything that had happened, nodding slowly, his expression grave. "This house is cursed," he said simply. "There is a darkness here, a presence that has taken root. It will not leave easily." He performed a blessing, walking through each room, sprinkling holy water and reciting prayers. The air in the house seemed to grow heavier with each word he spoke, the shadows deepening, pressing in around us. And then, just as he finished the final prayer, the house shook. A deep, rumbling sound echoed through the walls, and the lights flickered, then went out. We stood in the darkness, holding our breath, waiting for something to happen. But there was nothing, just an oppressive silence. The priest left shortly after, his face pale and drawn. "You must leave this place," he warned. "The curse is strong, and I fear it will not be broken easily." We didn't need to be told twice. We packed what we could and left Hollow Creek House that same night, driving away with no destination in mind, just wanting to get as far from that cursed place as possible. We never went back. The house still stands, abandoned and overgrown, a dark stain on the landscape. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if we had stayed, if we had tried to fight whatever evil had taken hold of that place. But I'm glad we didn't, because every now and then I dream of that house, of the shadows that move on their own, of the smell of death that filled the air, and of the figure that stood at the top of the stairs, watching, waiting. And when I wake up, drenched in sweat, I can still hear the echo of those footsteps following me even now. When we first saw the house, it seemed like a dream come true. Nestled at the end of a long, winding dirt road, surrounded by thick woods and a babbling creek. Hollow Creek House was everything we'd ever wanted, a place to raise our kids, far from the chaos of the city, where the air was clean and the nights were quiet. The real estate agent had been a bit vague about the house's history, but the price was right, and we were eager to leave the hustle and bustle behind. We didn't question why such a beautiful property had been on the market for so long. In hindsight, we should have. Moving day was hectic, but we finally got everything inside and settled down for our first night in our new home. The kids, Ella and Josh, were excited, racing from room to room, exploring every nook and cranny. My wife, Sarah, and I were exhausted but happy, thrilled to be starting this new chapter in our lives. The first few nights passed without incident. The house was old, and it creaked and groaned as it settled, but that was to be expected. We spent our days unpacking and getting to know the property, exploring the woods, and finding new places to play by the creek. It was idyllic, like something out of a storybook. But then strange things began to happen. It started small doors that we knew we had closed would be found open, lights flickering even though the bulbs were brand new, and a persistent feeling of being watched, especially at night. The kids started waking up in the middle of the night, complaining of bad dreams. Ella, our youngest, said she kept seeing a shadowy figure standing in the corner of her room. We chalked it up to the stress of the move, reassuring her that it was just her imagination, but the more we reassured her, the more insistent she became. Josh, too, started to complain about the house. He said he didn't like going down to the basement because it felt weird. I couldn't argue with him. There was something about that basement that made my skin crawl. It was cold and damp, even in the middle of summer, and the air felt thick, like it was pressing down on you. but I told him not to worry, that there was nothing down there but old pipes and dusty boxes. Then, one night, Sarah and I were awoken by a loud crash from downstairs. We rushed down to find the kitchen in disarray, cabinets flung open, dishes shattered on the floor, and a cold breeze blowing through the room. The back door was wide open, swinging gently on its hinges. I checked every window and door, but there was no sign of forced entry, no sign that anyone had been there but us. We were rattled, but we tried to stay calm, telling ourselves it was just the wind or maybe an animal that had somehow gotten inside. But deep down, we both knew something was wrong. The activity in the house escalated quickly after that. Shadows flitted through the corners of our vision, low whispers that seemed to come from nowhere, and the feeling that we were never truly alone. The children's nightmares became more frequent, and Ella's insistence that she was seeing someone in her room grew more desperate. We were on edge, snapping at each other, our nerves frayed by the constant tension. One evening I was outside chopping wood when I saw something that made my blood run cold. Standing at the edge of the woods, just beyond the creek, was a figure, a tall, thin man in what looked like old-fashioned clothing. He was just standing there, staring at me, his face hidden in shadow. I dropped the axe and called out to him, but he didn't move, didn't react in any way. My heart pounded as I took a step forward, and that's when he disappeared, fading into the trees like a wisp of smoke. I stood there, frozen, my mind racing to make sense of what I had just seen. I didn't tell Sarah about it. I didn't want to scare her more than she already was. But that night, as we sat in the living room, I could tell she knew something was wrong. There was a heaviness in the air, a feeling like we were being watched from the shadows just beyond the firelight. That's when the smell started. It was faint at first, like something rotten, something decaying, wafting through the house. We searched everywhere but couldn't find the source. The smell grew stronger each day, until it permeated every room, making it nearly impossible to stay inside. The kids refused to sleep in their rooms, and I didn't blame them. We all started sleeping in the living room, the only place where the smell wasn't as strong, huddled together on the couch. One night, as we lay there in the dark, I heard the sound of footsteps on the stairs, slow, deliberate, getting closer and closer. My heart raced as I sat up, listening, straining to see in the dim light. The footsteps stopped at the top of the stairs, just outside the living room. I held my breath, waiting, but there was nothing, just silence. I don't know what possessed me, but I got up and crept towards the stairs, my breath coming in short, shallow gasps. I peered up into the darkness, and there, at the top of the stairs, was the figure, the same one I had seen by the creek. He was closer now, and I could see his face, a twisted, grotesque mask of rage and pain. He opened his mouth, and a low, guttural sound filled the air, a sound that made my blood run cold. I stumbled back, nearly falling as I scrambled to get away, but when I looked again, he was gone. The next day I called a priest. I didn't care if it sounded crazy. I was desperate. The priest arrived that afternoon, an older man with a kind face and a calm demeanor. He listened as I told him everything that had happened, nodding slowly, his expression grave. "This house is cursed," he said simply. "There is a darkness here, a presence that has taken root. It will not leave easily." He performed a blessing, walking through each room, sprinkling holy water and reciting prayers. The air in the house seemed to grow heavier with each word he spoke, the shadows deepening, pressing in around us. And then, just as he finished the final prayer, the house shook. A deep, rumbling sound echoed through the walls, and the lights flickered, then went out. We stood in the darkness, holding our breath, waiting for something to happen. But there was nothing, just an oppressive silence. The priest left shortly after, his face pale and drawn. "You must leave this place," he warned. "The curse is strong, and I fear it will not be broken easily." We didn't need to be told twice. We packed what we could and left Hollow Creek House that same night, driving away with no destination in mind, just wanting to get as far from that cursed place as possible. We never went back. The house still stands, abandoned and overgrown, a dark stain on the landscape. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if we had stayed, if we had tried to fight whatever evil had taken hold of that place. But I'm glad we didn't, because every now and then I dream of that house, of the shadows that move on their own, of the smell of death that filled the air, and of the figure that stood at the top of the stairs, watching, waiting. And when I wake up, drenched in sweat, I can still hear the echo of those footsteps following me even now. Elkmont, Tennessee is known for its serene beauty. Nestled within the Great Smoky Mountains, the park draws visitors from all over who come to hike, camp, and take in the breathtaking scenery. But as a park ranger, I know there's more to Elkmont than meets the eye. There are places within those woods that few people know about, places that even seasoned hikers avoid. I've spent over 15 years patrolling those trails, keeping visitors safe, and making sure nature is respected. But there's one night that still haunts me, a night that changed how I see those mountains forever. It was late October, and the park was quieter than usual. The summer crowds had gone, leaving behind a calm stillness that settled over the land. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of fallen leaves and damp earth. I was on the night shift, a routine patrol that I had done countless times before, but this night was different. It was colder than usual, the wind biting through my jacket as I drove along the narrow, winding roads that crisscrossed the park. The headlights of my Jeep cut through the darkness, casting long, eerie shadows across the trees. The radio was silent, a rarity on such a long shift, but I didn't mind the quiet. It gave me time to think, to reflect on the years I had spent in these woods. As I drove deeper into the park, I decided to take a detour. There was an old, abandoned logging camp not far from where I was, a place that had been left to rot decades ago. It wasn't on any official map, just a forgotten corner of the park that few people knew about. The locals called it Ghost Camp because of the stories, tales of strange lights, voices in the woods, and the feeling of being watched. I'd been there a few times during the day, but never at night. Something compelled me to check it out, a nagging curiosity that I couldn't shake. The road to Ghost Camp was barely more than a dirt path, overgrown with weeds and littered with fallen branches. I had to slow down to a crawl, the Jeep's tires crunching over the debris. The trees seemed to close in around me, their gnarled branches reaching out like skeletal hands. As I neared the camp, the air grew colder, and the shadows seemed to deepen, pressing in from all sides. When I reached the clearing where the camp stood, I parked the Jeep and killed the engine. The silence was immediate and overwhelming, as if the woods themselves were holding their breath. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped out, the cold biting into my skin as I made my way toward the dilapidated buildings. The camp was a cluster of old wooden shacks, their roofs caved in and their walls sagging with age. The wind whistled through the cracks, carrying with it the faint smell of decay. I shone my flashlight across the camp, the beam cutting through the darkness. Everything was still, but there was a heaviness in the air, a sense of something waiting just beyond the reach of the light. I walked slowly, the crunch of dead leaves beneath my boots the only sound. I checked each building, one by one, finding nothing but old, rusted tools and decaying furniture. But as I approached the last shack, I felt a sudden wave of unease. The hair on the back of my neck stood on end, and I had the distinct feeling that I wasn't alone. I hesitated, my flashlight beam wavering as I scanned the area. That's when I heard it, a low, almost imperceptible whisper, carried on the wind. It was so faint that I thought I might have imagined it, but then I heard it again, clearer this time, a voice, soft and mournful, calling out from the darkness. "Help me!" My heart raced, the sound sending a chill down my spine. I turned in a slow circle, my flashlight sweeping across the trees, but there was no one there. The voice came again, closer now, as if whoever it was standing right next to me. "Help me!" I swallowed hard, trying to steady my breathing. I knew these woods better than anyone, knew every trail, every landmark, but this was something different. I forced myself to move forward, stepping up to the door of the last shack. The wood was old and brittle, creaking under my weight as I pushed it open. The inside was dark, the smell of rot and mildew overwhelming. I swept the flashlight around the room, revealing broken furniture and a crumbling fireplace. But there was something else, something that made my blood run cold. Scrawled across the walls in what looked like dark, dried paint were words, desperate, pleading words. "Help me, they're coming. Can't escape, please." My heart pounded in my chest as I read the words, a sense of dread settling over me. The voice came again, louder now, echoing through the shack, "Help me." I spun around, shining the flashlight toward the corner of the room, and that's when I saw it. A figure huddled in the corner, barely visible in the dim light. It was a man, his clothes torn and dirty, his face pale and gaunt. His eyes were wide with fear, his hands clutching something tightly to his chest. "Help me," he whispered, his voice trembling. I took a step closer, my mind racing. "Who are you?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. The man didn't answer. He just stared at me, his eyes filled with a terror that I couldn't comprehend. Then, in one swift movement, he held out what he had been clutching to his chest. It was a book, old and tattered, its pages yellowed with age. "Take it," he said, his voice urgent. "You have to take it." I hesitated for a moment, then reached out and took the book from him. The moment it touched my hands, a chill ran through my body, and the room seemed to grow darker. The man's eyes locked onto mine, and he whispered, "It's the only way. You have to stop them." Before I could ask him what he meant, the shack was suddenly filled with a deafening roar, like the sound of 1,000 voices screaming in unison. The walls shook, dust and debris raining down from the ceiling. I stumbled back, clutching the book to my chest, my flashlight flickering as the room plunged into darkness. The roar grew louder, the ground trembling beneath my feet. And then, as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. The silence that followed was absolute, the only sound my own ragged breathing. I stood there, frozen, my mind struggling to process what had just happened. When I finally gathered the courage to move, I shone the flashlight toward the corner where the man had been. But he was gone, the shack was empty, the air heavy with an oppressive silence. I didn't waste any time. I bolted out of the shack, the cold night air hitting me like a slap in the face. I ran to the jeep, my heart racing, the book clutched tightly in my hands. I didn't look back, didn't stop until I was safely back at the ranger station. That night I couldn't sleep. I sat at my desk, staring at the book, trying to make sense of what had happened. The cover was worn and faded, the pages filled with strange symbols, and writings in a language I didn't understand. But there was one page, near the middle of the book, that was different. It had a drawing, a crude, almost childlike sketch of a group of figures standing in the woods, their eyes black and empty. And beneath the drawing, in shaky scroll handwriting, were the words, "They come at night." I knew then that the man I had seen wasn't just some lost hiker or camper. He was something else, something that had been trapped in those woods for who knows how long. And the book. It was a warning, a plea for help from someone who'd seen the darkness that lurked in Elkmont. I turned in the book to the authorities, but they dismissed it as a hoax, a prank played by some overzealous ghost hunter. But I know better. I've seen those woods at night. I've heard the voices, felt the presence that stalks the trees, and I know that whatever is out there, it's still waiting, still watching. I left my job as a park ranger not long after that night. I couldn't stay, not after what I'd experienced, but even now, years later, I can't shake the feeling that I'm being watched, that something from those woods followed me home. And every time I close my eyes, I see those figures standing in the shadows, their empty eyes staring back at me, waiting for the night to fall. It was the summer of 1996, and I had just moved into a small, two-bedroom house in a quiet neighborhood on the outskirts of town. The house wasn't anything special, a bit old and creaky, with peeling wallpaper and a yard that needed serious work, but it was mine, and I was proud of it. I had saved up for years, working extra shifts at the diner, and now, finally, I had a place to call my own. The first few weeks were uneventful. I spent most of my time cleaning, painting, and unpacking, slowly turning the house into a home. My neighbors were friendly enough, though they mostly kept to themselves. The couple next door, Mr. and Mrs. Harper, were in their 70s and rarely left the house. Across the street was a young family with 2 small children, and a few houses down lived a middle-aged man named Carl, who always seemed to be working on his car in the driveway. It was a quiet, sleepy street, exactly what I had been looking for. But then things started to change. It began with the noises, strange, unexplainable sounds that seemed to come from the attic late at night. At first I thought it was just the house settling, or maybe a raccoon that had found its way in. But the sounds were too deliberate, too rhythmic, like footsteps pacing back and forth across the floor above my head. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was just my imagination, but the noises continued, growing louder and more persistent with each passing night. It was always the same. Around midnight, the footsteps would start, slow and deliberate, moving from one end of the attic to the other. They would last for hours, sometimes until dawn, and no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't sleep through them. After about a week of sleepless nights, I decided to investigate. Armed with a flashlight and a baseball bat, I climbed the narrow, creaky stairs to the attic. The air was thick with dust, and the wooden floorboards groaned under my weight. The attic was empty, just a few old boxes and some forgotten furniture covered in cobwebs. I searched every corner, checked every nook and cranny, but found nothing that could explain the noises. I went back downstairs, feeling foolish. It had to be the house settling, I told myself, or maybe just the wind. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. The next night, the footsteps returned, louder than ever. They seemed to echo through the house, filling every room with a sense of dread that I couldn't shake. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the relentless pacing above me, my heart racing with fear. I wanted to leave, to run out of the house, and never look back. But I couldn't. This was my home, and I wasn't about to let some strange noises drive me away. The following day, I mentioned the noises to Mr. Harper while I was out in the yard. He listened quietly, his face unreadable, before finally speaking. "You should have the attic checked," he said, his voice low and serious. "Houses this old, sometimes they have problems." "What kind of problems?" I asked, but he just shook his head and walked away without another word. That night the footsteps were louder than ever, almost frantic, as if something or someone was trapped up there, desperate to get out. I couldn't take it any more. I grabbed my flashlight and the bat, and once again made my way up to the attic. But this time I wasn't alone. As I reached the top of the stairs, I saw a figure standing in the middle of the room. It was tall and gaunt, its face hidden in the shadows. My heart stopped, and I froze, the flashlight shaking in my hand. The figure didn't move, didn't make a sound. It just stood there, watching me. I don't know how long we stood there, staring at each other in the dim light of the attic. It could have been seconds, or it could have been hours. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of what I was seeing, but nothing made sense. I wanted to scream, to run, but I couldn't move. I was paralyzed with fear. And then, without warning, the figure lunged at me. I stumbled backward, barely managing to stay on my feet as I swung the bat wildly in front of me. The figure dodged, moving with unnatural speed and grace, its movements fluid and almost inhuman. I could hear its ragged breathing, feel the cold air that seemed to emanate from it as it closed in on me. I swung the bat again, and this time I connected. There was a sickening thud as the bat struck the figure's head, and it crumpled to the floor. I stood there, panting, my heart pounding in my chest, staring down at the motionless body. My mind was racing, trying to comprehend what had just happened, but it was all a blur. I was in shock, unable to process the events that had just unfolded. Slowly, cautiously, I approached the figure, the flashlight beam shaking in my trembling hand. As I drew closer, the details of the figure became clearer. It was a man, his face gaunt and pale, his eyes wide open and staring blankly up at the ceiling. He was dressed in dirty, tattered clothes, and his skin was stretched tight over his bones, giving him a skeletal appearance. He looked like he hadn't eaten in weeks, maybe months, but the most disturbing thing was the expression on his face. Even in death, his face was twisted into a look of pure, unadulterated terror, as if he had seen something so horrifying that it had driven him to madness. I stumbled back, nearly dropping the flashlight. My mind was reeling, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Who was this man? How had he gotten into my attic? And what had he seen that had terrified him so? I didn't have time to think. I needed to get out of the house, needed to call the police. I turned and fled down the stairs, my heart racing as I fumbled for my phone. But when I reached the bottom, I stopped dead in my tracks. Standing in the middle of my living room, locking the front door, was another figure. This one was smaller, more hunched over, its face obscured by a tangle of dirty hair. It was muttering to itself, a low, guttural sound that sent chills down my spine. My breath caught in my throat as I slowly backed away, trying to stay as quiet as possible. But the figure heard me. It turned its head, and for the first time I saw its face. It was a woman, or at least what had once been a woman. Her skin was pale and sickly, her eyes sunken deep into her skull. She stared at me with a look of such intense hatred that I felt my blood run cold. I turned and bolted for the back door, but before I could reach it, she was on me. She moved with inhuman speed, grabbing me by the arm and pulling me back toward the living room. I struggled, kicking and thrashing, but her grip was like iron. She dragged me across the floor, her muttering growing louder, more frantic. I caught snippets of words. He saw the darkness. We mustn't let them out. But it was all gibberish, nonsensical ramblings of a madwoman. I managed to twist free, scrambling to my feet and grabbing a nearby lamp. I swung it at her with all my might, the base connecting with her head with a sickening crunch. She collapsed to the floor, her body twitching spasmodically as I stood over her, gasping for breath. I didn't waste any more time. I ran for the door, flinging it open and sprinting out into the night. I didn't stop running until I reached the Harper's house, pounding on the door and screaming for help. The police arrived within minutes, but by the time they searched my house, there was no sign of the man or the woman. The attic was empty, the living room spotless, as if nothing had ever happened. They searched the entire house, top to bottom, but found no evidence of the intruders. No footprints, no bloodstains, nothing. I told them everything about the noises, the figures in the attic, the attack, but they didn't believe me. They thought I was crazy, imagining things. But I knew what I had seen, what I had experienced. I couldn't stay in that house after that. I sold it within a week, moving in with my sister until I could find somewhere else to live. But the memories of that night still haunt me. I can't explain what happened, can't rationalize the things I saw. All I know is that something was in that house, something evil, something that drove those people to madness. And sometimes, late at night, I still hear the footsteps, pacing back and forth, just beyond the edge of sleep. The town of Hollow Ridge wasn't much to look at, just a few dusty streets lined with old brick buildings, most of them long abandoned. The town had seen better days, that much was clear. It was one of those places you might pass through without a second glance, barely a dot on the map. But there was one place in Hollow Ridge that no one could ignore, the church. Hollow Ridge Church stood at the edge of town, its tall spire reaching into the sky like a warning finger. The building was old, built sometime in the 1800s, with crumbling stone walls and a roof that sagged under the weight of time. But it wasn't the age of the church that kept people away. It was the stories. People said the church was cursed, that it was a place of darkness. Over the years, there had been countless reports of strange happenings, objects moving on their own, eerie voices echoing through the empty halls, and shadows that seemed to come alive. Some even claimed that people who entered the church were never the same afterward, as if something inside had taken hold of them. I didn't believe in any of that, of course. I was a man of reason, a journalist by trade, and I prided myself on my ability to separate fact from fiction. So when I heard about the church and the supposed curse, I saw it as nothing more than an opportunity to debunk some local superstition. I decided to spend a night inside the church, to document what I found and put the rumors to rest once and for all. I arrived in Hollow Ridge on a crisp autumn afternoon, the sun low in the sky. The town was quiet, almost too quiet, as if it had been forgotten by the rest of the world. The locals eyed me warily as I passed, their faces a mixture of curiosity and fear. They knew why I was there, and they didn't like it. The church loomed over the town like a specter, its shadow stretching long across the ground. As I approached, I couldn't help but feel a chill run down my spine. The air seemed to grow colder the closer I got, and the wind picked up, howling through the trees like a mournful wail. I pushed open the heavy wooden doors and stepped inside. The air was thick with dust, and the floor creaked under my feet. The interior of the church was just as dilapidated as the outside. Pews lay overturned, windows were shattered, and the altar was covered in a thick layer of grime. But there was something else, something that I couldn't quite put my finger on. It was as if the very air was charged with a malevolent energy, something dark, and oppressive that seemed to seep into my bones. I shook off the feeling and set to work, setting up my camera and recording equipment. I planned to document everything, to capture any evidence of the so-called haunting. But as the sun set and the church was plunged into darkness, I began to feel uneasy. The silence was deafening, broken only by the occasional creak of the building settling. I tried to focus on my work, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. It started with small things at first, shadows flickering at the edge of my vision, a faint whisper that I couldn't quite make out. I told myself it was just my imagination, that I was letting the stories get to me. But then the temperature dropped so suddenly that I could see my breath in the air. The cold was unnatural, biting through my clothes and chilling me to the core. I checked my equipment, but everything seemed to be in working order. I tried to ignore the growing sense of dread that gnawed at the edges of my mind, but it was becoming harder with each passing minute. The whispers grew louder, more insistent. As if something was trying to communicate with me, I decided to take a break, to step outside and clear my head. But as I reached for the door, it wouldn't budge. I pulled harder, but it was as if the door was fused to the frame. Panic began to set in as I realized I was trapped. And then the whispers stopped, replaced by a deep, guttural voice that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. It spoke in a language I didn't understand, the words harsh and grating. My heart pounded in my chest as I spun around, searching for the source of the voice. But there was nothing there, just darkness. Suddenly the church was filled with a blinding light. I shielded my eyes, stumbling backward as the light grew brighter and brighter. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the light was gone, leaving me in total darkness. I stood there, my heart racing, trying to make sense of what had just happened. But before I could collect my thoughts, the voice returned, louder this time, and filled with a rage that shook me to my core. I don't know how long I stood there, frozen in fear, as the voice ranted and raved in that strange, incomprehensible language. But eventually it began to change. The words became slower, more deliberate, and I started to recognize them. It was speaking English now, but the voice was different, calm, almost soothing. "You shouldn't have come here," it said, the words echoing through the empty church. "This place is not for the living." I opened my mouth to speak, but no sound came out. My throat was dry and my mind was racing. I didn't know what to do, didn't know how to respond. All I could do was stand there, paralyzed by fear. "You are trespassing," the voice continued, "and you will pay the price." Suddenly, the room was filled with a deafening roar, like 1,000 voices screaming in unison. The walls began to shake, and the floor beneath me buckled as if the very earth was trying to swallow me whole. I dropped to my knees, covering my ears as the noise grew louder and louder, until I thought my head would explode. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the noise stopped. The church was silent once again, but the air was thick with tension, like the calm before a storm. I didn't have time to react before I was thrown backward, slamming into the wall with enough force to knock the breath out of me. I struggled to get to my feet, but it was like something was holding me down, pinning me in place. The voice returned, but it was different now, colder, more menacing. "You belong to us now," it said, and I felt a cold, clammy hand wrap around my throat. I gasped for air, clawing at the invisible hand that was choking the life out of me, but it was no use. My vision began to blur, and the edges of my world started to go dark. Just when I thought I was going to die, the grip loosened, and I fell to the floor, coughing and gasping for air. I tried to stand, but my legs wouldn't support me. I could feel the presence all around me, closing in, suffocating me with its darkness. I crawled toward the door, my hands trembling as I reached for the handle. It turned easily this time, and I stumbled out into the night, collapsing on the ground outside. I don't know how long I lay there, staring up at the sky, trying to catch my breath. But eventually, I managed to get to my feet and staggered away from the church. Never looking back, I left Hollow Ridge the next morning, my mind still reeling from what had happened. I tried to write about it, to document the experience, but every time I tried to put it into words, the memories would overwhelm me, filling me with a terror that I couldn't shake. I never went back to Hollow Ridge, and I never set foot in another church again. I don't know what I encountered in that place, but I know one thing for sure: there are some places in this world that are better left alone. The long-haul trucking life isn't for everyone. It's a lonely job with hours upon hours of solitude on the open road, but for me, it was the only life I knew. I've been driving rigs across the country for nearly 20 years, and in that time, I've seen it all: bad weather, crazy drivers, and enough roadside diners to last a lifetime. But nothing prepared me for what happened on that stretch of highway between Arizona and Nevada. It was supposed to be a routine job, just another haul from Phoenix to Las Vegas. I was hauling a load of electronics, nothing special, but the money was good, and I needed to pay off some bills. The trip started like any other. I left Phoenix in the late afternoon, the sun dipping low in the sky as I merged onto the interstate. The highway was quiet, with only a few cars and trucks sharing the road. I settled in for the long drive, my mind wandering as the miles ticked by. By the time night fell, I was somewhere in the middle of the desert, a landscape around me a vast, empty expanse of sand and rock. The only light came from my headlights, illuminating the road ahead in a narrow beam. The sky was clear, the stars scattered like diamonds across the black canvas of night. I was making good time, the hum of the engine and the rhythm of the road lulling me into a state of relaxed focus. That's when I saw a figure standing on the side of the road, just at the edge of my headlights. At first I thought it was a hitchhiker, but as I got closer, I realized it was a woman. She was standing perfectly still, her long hair blowing in the wind, her eyes locked onto my truck as I approached. There was something off about her, something that sent a shiver down my spine. I slowed down, my instincts telling me to stop, but something else, something deeper, telling me to keep going. Against my better judgment, I pulled over, the tires of my rig crunching on the gravel shoulder. The woman didn't move, just stood there, staring at me with those piercing eyes. I rolled down the window, leaning out to get a better look. "You okay, ma'am?" I called out. She didn't answer right away, just kept staring at me with those eyes. Then, in a voice that was barely more than a whisper, she said, "I need help." There was something in her voice, something that tugged at my heart. I'd seen my share of lost souls on the road, people who had nowhere to go, nothing left to lose. But this was different. This woman wasn't just lost, she was desperate. I couldn't just leave her there, so I got out of the truck and walked over to her. Up close, she looked even more fragile than I had thought. Her clothes were dirty and torn, her skin pale and sickly. But it was her eyes that caught me off guard. There was a sadness in them, a deep, aching sorrow that seemed to reach out and wrap around me. "What happened to you?" I asked, trying to keep my voice calm. She looked down at her hands, and that's when I saw it, a ring, old and tarnished, wrapped tightly around her finger. It didn't look like it belonged to her, like it was something ancient, something that had been passed down through generations. "It's the ring," she said, her voice trembling. "It's cursed." I frowned, not sure if I'd heard her right. "Cursed?" She nodded. tears welling up in her eyes. I found it in an old pawn shop in Flagstaff. The owner warned me not to buy it, said it was cursed, but I didn't believe him. I thought it was just a story, just some old superstition. But as soon as I put it on, things started happening, terrible things. I didn't know what to say. I wasn't one to believe in curses or ghosts or any of that stuff, but there was something in her eyes that made me pause, something that told me she believed every word she was saying. I tried to take it off. She continued, her voice shaking, but it won't come off. It's like it's stuck to my skin, like it's part of me now. And every time I try, something terrible happens. The people I love, they're all gone. It's my fault, the ring. It won't let me go. I looked at the ring, a sense of unease creeping into my chest. I'd heard stories about cursed objects before, but I'd always dismissed them as nonsense. But standing there, in the middle of the desert, with this woman who seemed so broken, I wasn't so sure anymore. Maybe I can help, I said, though I had no idea how. She shook her head, tears streaming down her face. No one can help me. It's too late. But maybe you can help yourself. Don't take it. Don't let it take you. I didn't understand what she meant, but before I could ask, she grabbed my hand, pressing something cold and hard into my palm. It was the ring. I looked down at it, shock running through me. Wait. I started, but she was already backing away, her eyes filled with fear. I'm sorry, she whispered, and then she turned and ran into the darkness, disappearing into the night before I could stop her. I stood there, the ring clutched in my hand, not sure what to do. Part of me wanted to throw it away, to get rid of it as fast as I could. But another part of me, the part that had been raised to never turn my back on someone in need, felt compelled to keep it, to figure out what had happened to that woman and how to stop it. I got back into my truck, my mind racing, the ring heavy in my pocket. As I drove, strange things started to happen. The radio, which had been playing static, suddenly switched to an old country station, the music crackling through the speakers. The air in the cab grew colder, and I could swear I heard whispers, faint and distant, but growing louder. With every mile, the road stretched out before me, dark and endless, the desert around me a shadowy blur. My hands gripped the steering wheel, my knuckles white, as the feeling of unease grew stronger. And then the headlights flickered just for a moment, but long enough to send a jolt of fear through me. I glanced at the rearview mirror, half expecting to see anything out of the ordinary, but the road behind me was empty, just as it had been for the past few hours. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone, that something or someone was out there, watching, waiting. The ring seemed to grow heavier in my pocket, its presence a constant reminder of the woman and her story. I wanted to believe it was just a coincidence, that everything that was happening could be explained away, but deep down I knew better. By the time I reached the outskirts of Las Vegas, I was exhausted, both physically and mentally. I found a truck stopped just off the highway and pulled in, needing a break from the road. The place was nearly empty, just a few other rigs parked in the lot and a tired-looking waitress inside the diner. I went in, ordered a cup of coffee, and tried to clear my head. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't stop thinking about the ring, about the woman and her haunted eyes. I pulled the ring out of my pocket, turning it over in my hand. It was a simple band, worn and scratched, but there was something about it, something that made my skin crawl. I could almost feel it pulsing with energy, like it was alive. The door to the diner opened, and a man walked in. He was tall, with a weathered face, and a look of quiet intensity in his eyes. He walked straight to my table and sat down across from me, his gaze locked onto the ring in my hand. "You need to get rid of that," he said, his voice low and serious. I looked up at him, startled. "What?" "The ring," he repeated, nodding toward it. "It's cursed. It's not safe." I felt a chill run down my spine. "How do you know?" He leaned back in his seat, his eyes never leaving mine. "Because I've seen it before. I'm a collector of sorts, you might say. I track down objects like that ring, things that carry a dark history, things that shouldn't exist. And that ring, it's one of the worst." "What do you mean, worst?" I asked, my stomach knotting with dread. "That ring has a way of finding people," he said. "It latches on to them, feeds off their fear, their pain. It twists their lives, turns everything they love against them, and once it's cut its claws in you, there's no getting rid of it. Not unless you pass it on to someone else." My blood ran cold. "The woman," I began, but he cut me off. "She's gone, isn't she? That's how it works. The only way to escape it is to give it to someone else, but that just passes the curse along. It never really ends." I stared at the ring, my heart pounding in my chest. "What am I supposed to do with it?" He sighed, a weary look in his eyes. "You've got two choices. You can pass it on, just like she did, or you can destroy it, but that's easier said than done. That ring doesn't want to be destroyed. It'll fight you every step of the way. How do I destroy it?" I asked, desperation creeping into my voice. He reached into his coat and pulled out a small, leather-bound book. "There's a ritual," he said, sliding the book across the table to me. "But it's risky. You'll need to be careful. If you mess it up, you could end up making things worse." I took the book, my hands trembling. "Why are you helping me?" He gave me a sad smile. "Because I've seen what that ring can do, and because I've been in your shoes. I know what it's like to feel trapped, to feel like there's no way out. But there's a way. You just have to be strong enough to take it." I nodded, clutching the book to my chest. "Thank you." He stood up, giving me one last, lingering look. "Good luck," he said, and then he was gone, leaving me alone with the ring and the weight of the decision I had to make. I didn't sleep that night. I stayed in my truck, reading the book, trying to make sense of the ritual and what it would take to break the curse. It wasn't easy. There were symbols and words I didn't understand, steps that seemed impossible. But I had to try. I had to find a way to end it, for myself, for the woman, for everyone who had ever been touched by that cursed ring. As the first light of dawn broke over the horizon, I knew what I had to do. I drove out into the desert, far away from the city, far away from anyone who might get caught in the crossfire. I found a secluded spot, surrounded by nothing but sand and rocks, and I began the ritual. It was a long and difficult process, the air around me growing colder with each step. The wind picked up, whipping the sand into my eyes, making it hard to see, hard to focus. But I pressed on, chanting the words from the book, tracing the symbols in the dirt. As I neared the end of the ritual, the ground beneath me began to tremble, the air crackling with energy. The ring in my hand grew hot, burning my skin, but I held on, determined to see it through. And then, just as I spoke the final words, there was a blinding flash of light, a searing heat that shot through me, and then silence. I opened my eyes, blinking against the bright morning sun. The ring was gone, nothing but a pile of ash in its place. I had done it. The curse was broken. But as I stood there, staring at the ashes, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. I felt different, like a part of me had been burned away. Along with the ring, I knew I'd never be the same again. The road called to me, but I wasn't sure I could answer, not yet. I needed time to heal, time to understand what I'd been through. But one thing was certain: I would never forget the woman, the ring, or the darkness that had almost consumed me. And I would never let myself forget that some things are better left alone, that some roads should never be traveled. The production of Annabelle was well underway, and the eerie atmosphere of the film had begun to seep into our daily lives. The story of a possessed doll wreaking havoc on its owners was terrifying enough on screen, but the reality of what we experienced on set was far more chilling. We were filming a pivotal scene in which the doll, Annabelle, was meant to be discovered in a dark, shadowy corner of a nursery. The set was meticulously designed to evoke a sense of dread, with dim lighting and antique furniture casting long, sinister shadows. The doll itself, with its unsettling smile and vacant eyes, added to the overall sense of unease. As the cameras rolled, everything seemed to be going smoothly. The actors were in character, the lighting was perfect, and the doll sat motionless in its designated spot. Suddenly, without warning, the doll toppled over, landing face down on the floor. The director called cut, and the crew rushed in to reset the scene. As they did, one of the grips, a young man named Jake, let out a startled yelp. He had picked up the doll to place it back on the chair, but its head had twisted around in his hands. "I swear I didn't touch it," he stammered, his face pale. The crew laughed it off, attributing it to a loose joint or a trick of the light, but Jake's unease was palpable. We reset the scene and continued filming, but the mood had shifted. There was a sense of anticipation, as if we were all waiting for something to happen, and happen it did. As we moved to a close-up of the doll, the camera lens fogged up, obscuring the shot. The cameraman wiped it clean, but the fog returned almost immediately. Frustrated, the director called for a break while the equipment was checked. Everything appeared to be in working order, yet the lens continued to fog up every time we tried to film the doll. The air grew colder, and a sense of foreboding settled over the set. The doll seemed to stare back at us, its painted eyes following our every move. During the break, I wandered over to the craft services table to grab a coffee. As I stood there, I overheard two of the makeup artists talking in hushed tones. "Did you hear about the priest?" one of them whispered. My ears perked up, and I inched closer to listen. Apparently, a priest had visited the set earlier in the week to bless it, as a precaution against any negative energy. He had been walking through the different rooms, sprinkling holy water and saying prayers, when he suddenly stopped in front of the doll. According to the makeup artist, he had gone pale and backed away, muttering something about a powerful presence. Intrigued and slightly unnerved, I made a mental note to ask the director about it later. As the day went on, the strange occurrences continued. Lights flickered, props moved on their own, and the temperature fluctuated wildly. The sense of being watched grew stronger, and even the most skeptical crew members began to feel uneasy. That night, after we wrapped for the day, I stayed behind to review some footage. The studio was eerily quiet, the only sound the hum of the equipment and the occasional creak of the building settling. As I watched the scenes play out on the monitor, I noticed something strange. In several shots, a faint shadow appeared behind the actors, moving independently of the lighting and camera angles. I rewound the footage and played it again, my heart pounding. The shadow was there, unmistakable and chilling. It seemed to hover near the doll, its movements deliberate and menacing. I felt a cold shiver run down my spine and quickly shut down the equipment, eager to leave the studio. The next day, I shared my findings with the director and the rest of the crew. We gathered around the monitor, watching the footage in stunned silence. The shadow was clear, its presence undeniable. The director decided to consult a paranormal expert, hoping to get to the bottom of the mystery. Dr. Evelyn Martinez, a well-known parapsychologist, arrived on set later that afternoon. She was a calm, composed woman with a sharp mind and a wealth of experience in dealing with the supernatural. As she walked through the set, she took detailed notes and occasionally paused to take readings with her equipment. When she reached the nursery where the doll was kept, she stopped and closed her eyes, as if sensing something unseen. "There is a strong presence here," she said quietly, "something ancient and powerful." She placed her hand on the doll and immediately pulled back, her face a mask of concentration. "This object is a conduit," she continued. "It's drawing in energy from the environment and amplifying it." Dr. Martinez suggested performing a cleansing ritual to dispel the negative energy and break the connection between the doll and the supernatural force. The crew readily agreed, eager to rid the set of the unsettling presence. The ritual was scheduled for that evening, after filming had wrapped for the day. As night fell, the crew gathered in the nursery, the air heavy with anticipation. Dr. Martinez began the ritual, lighting candles and incense and reciting prayers in a low, steady voice. The atmosphere grew tense, and the temperature dropped sharply. The shadows seemed to dance on the walls, and the doll's eyes glinted in the candlelight. Halfway through the ritual, there was a loud crash, and the lights went out. Panic spread through the room, and the crew huddled together, their breaths visible in the cold air. Dr. Martinez continued her prayers, her voice unwavering. The sense of dread intensified, and a low growl echoed through the room. Suddenly, the doll's head turned, and its eyes seemed to glow with a malevolent light. The growl grew louder, and the walls trembled. Dr. Martinez raised her voice, commanding the spirit to leave. The air crackled with energy, and the candles flickered violently. Then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the growl ceased, and the room fell silent. The oppressive weight lifted, and the temperature returned to normal. The lights flickered back on, and the doll lay motionless on the chair, its eyes dull and lifeless once more. Dr. Martinez finished the ritual and turned to us, her face pale but resolute. "The connection has been severed," she said, "but you must be careful. Objects like this can attract negative energy, and the forces at play are not easily dismissed." The set felt different after that night. The strange occurrences ceased, and the sense of dread dissipated. We completed the film without further incident, and Annabelle went on to become a major hit. But for those of us who had experienced the haunting firsthand, the memory of that malevolent presence lingered. Years later, I still think about the doll and the dark figure that had haunted our set. It serves as a reminder of the thin line between fiction and reality, and the power of belief in the supernatural. The experience taught me to respect the stories we tell and the forces that exist beyond our understanding. The haunting of the Annabelle set was more than just a series of strange events. It was a profound encounter with the unknown, one that I will never forget. The night I first encountered the creature was like any other in Cedar Creek, a small, sleepy town nestled deep within the Appalachian Mountains. The area was known for its dense forests, rolling hills, and a sense of isolation that could either be comforting or unsettling depending on who you asked. For me, the quiet was a welcome change from the chaos of city life, a chance to get away from it all and reconnect with nature. I had rented a small cabin on the outskirts of town, a place where I could clear my mind and work on my writing without distractions. The cabin was simple, but it had everything I needed: a bed, a wood stove, and a small kitchen. There was no internet, no cell service, and the nearest neighbor was miles away. It was perfect. The first few nights were uneventful. I spent my days hiking through the woods, exploring the trails that wound through the mountains, and my evenings sitting by the fire, reading or jotting down notes for my next book. The forest was alive with the sounds of nature: crickets chirping, owls hooting, and the occasional rustle of leaves as a deer or some other creature passed by. It was peaceful. Then, on the fourth night, something changed. It started with a sound, a low, guttural growl that echoed through the trees. I was sitting on the porch, enjoying the cool night air, when I heard it. At first I thought it was just a bear or a coyote, common enough in these parts, but there was something about the sound that sent a chill down my spine. It was deeper, more menacing than anything I'd heard before. I listened for a moment, but the growl didn't come again, and I shrugged it off as my imagination playing tricks on me. I went back inside, locked the door, and went to bed. The next morning, I found strange tracks in the dirt outside the cabin. They were unlike any animal tracks I'd ever seen: large, with long, clawed toes, almost like a wolf's, but much bigger. I bent down to examine them, trying to make sense of what could have left such marks. I'm not a tracker, but I'd seen enough wildlife documentaries to know that whatever had made those tracks was something I didn't want to run into. I decided to stay close to the cabin that day, not venturing too far into the woods. There was a sense of unease hanging in the air, a feeling that I was being watched. I couldn't shake the feeling, no matter how hard I tried to focus on other things. As night fell, I found myself on edge, jumping at every little sound. I locked all the doors and windows, drawing the curtains tight, and sat by the fire with a book, trying to calm my nerves. But the growl came again, closer this time. My heart raced as I listened to the sound, low and menacing, just outside the cabin. It circled the building, moving slowly, deliberately, as if it was searching for a way in. I grabbed the rifle I'd brought with me just in case and sat in the middle of the room, the barrel pointed at the door. I didn't sleep that night, and the growling continued until the first light of dawn. When the sun finally rose, the growling stopped, and I heard the creature retreat into the woods. I rushed outside to check the tracks, but they were gone, as if they had never been there. But I knew what I'd heard, and I knew it wasn't my imagination. Over the next few days, the growling returned each night, always after dark, always circling the cabin. It grew louder, more insistent, as if the creature was becoming bolder, more determined to get inside. I barely slept, my nerves frayed, my body exhausted. I tried to call for help, but there was no signal, and the nearest town was too far to reach on foot. I was trapped, alone with whatever was out there, and I knew it was only a matter of time before it made its move. Then, on the seventh night, the growling stopped. The silence was worse, somehow, than the growling. It was as if the forest itself was holding its breath, waiting for something terrible to happen. I sat in the dark, clutching the rifle, my eyes fixed on the door. Hours passed, but nothing happened. Just when I started to think the creature had given up, I heard a soft scratching at the window. My blood ran cold as I turned to look, and there it was. The creature was unlike anything I had ever seen, a nightmare made flesh. It stood on two legs, towering over the window, its formatted and dark, almost black. Its eyes glowed with an unnatural light, and its mouth was filled with sharp, jagged teeth. It looked like a wolf, but its limbs were longer, more human-like, and its claws were long enough to tear through flesh. The scratching grew louder, more frantic, as if it was trying to get in. I raised the rifle, aiming at the window, but my hands were shaking so badly that I could barely keep it steady. The creature's eyes locked onto mine, and I felt a wave of terror wash over me. It knew I was afraid, and it was feeding off that fear. Then, without warning, the creature lunged at the window, shattering the glass with a deafening crash. I fired the rifle, the shot echoing through the cabin, but the creature was too fast. It was inside before I could react, its claws slashing through the air as it charged at me. I fired again, and this time I hit it. The creature let out a blood-curdling howl, a sound that will haunt me for the rest of my life, and staggered back, blood oozing from the wound. But it didn't stop. It came at me again, and I knew I was out of time. In a last-ditch effort, I grabbed the poker from the fireplace and swung it with all my might. The iron connected with the creature's skull, and it let out another howl before collapsing to the ground. I didn't wait to see if it was dead. I ran out of the cabin into the woods, not stopping until I reached the main road. I flagged down the first car I saw, a truck driven by an old man who looked at me like I was crazy when I tried to explain what had happened. He took me into town, where I called the authorities, but by the time they reached the cabin, the creature was gone. There was no sign of it, no blood, no tracks, nothing to prove that it had ever been there. But I knew what I'd seen, and I knew I couldn't stay in Cedar Creek any longer. I packed up my things and left that same day, vowing never to return. To this day, I don't know what that creature was, but I know one thing for sure. The beast of Cedar Creek is real, and it's still out there, somewhere in those dark, twisted woods, waiting for its next victim. I've been driving a taxi in the city for nearly a decade. It's not the most glamorous job, but it pays the bills, and I've always enjoyed the freedom of the open road. You get to meet all sorts of people, some friendly, some not so much, but they all have their stories. After a while, you start to get a sense for people. You can tell when someone's had a rough day, or when they're looking for something more than just a ride. But nothing could have prepared me for the night I picked up that passenger, the one who left me questioning everything I thought I knew about the world. It was a cold winter evening, the kind where the city feels like it's wrapped in a blanket of silence. The streets were mostly empty, the occasional car passing by, its headlights cutting through the darkness. I was on my usual route, heading back toward downtown after dropping off a fare in a quiet neighborhood on the outskirts of the city. I just turned onto a side street when I saw her. She was standing on the corner, her hand raised in that universal gesture that every cabbie knows. At first glance, she seemed like any other passenger, young, dressed in a long coat, her hair pulled back in a loose bun. But there was something about her that made me hesitate. Maybe it was the way she stood there, so still, like she was waiting for something more than just a taxi. Or maybe it was the way she looked at me as I pulled up to the curb, her eyes wide and unblinking, like she was surprised that I'd actually stopped. Whatever it was, it sent a shiver down my spine. But I couldn't just drive away, so I rolled down the window and asked if she needed a ride. She nodded, her expression unreadable, and got into the back seat. "Where to?" I asked, glancing at her in the rearview mirror. She gave me an address on the other side of town, in a neighborhood I didn't usually go to. I knew the place everyone in the city did, but I'd never had a reason to go there. The ride was quiet, the only sound the hum of the engine, and the occasional crackle of the radio. I tried to make small talk, but she wasn't interested. She just stared out the window, her face pale and expressionless, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. There was something unsettling about the way she sat there, so still, so silent. I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something wrong, that maybe I should turn around and drop her off somewhere else. Anywhere but where she wanted to go. But I didn't. I kept driving, the city lights fading behind us as we headed deeper into the old industrial district. The buildings around us grew darker, more decrepit, the streets narrower and more deserted. I could feel the tension building in the air, a sense of dread settling over me like a heavy blanket. And then, just as we reached the edge of the neighborhood, she spoke. "You can stop here," she said, her voice barely more than a whisper. I glanced at her in the mirror, surprised. "Here? Are you sure?" She nodded, her eyes still fixed on something outside the window. I followed her gaze, but saw nothing but darkness, the outline of a few old buildings barely visible in the distance. There was no one around, no lights, no signs of life. It didn't make any sense. But I pulled over to the side of the road, my heart pounding in my chest. She didn't move, didn't say anything, just sat there, staring out into the night. "Do you need help with something?" I asked, not sure what else to say. She turned to look at me then, her eyes wide and filled with something I couldn't quite place. Fear, maybe, or sadness. "No," she said softly. "I just needed to get here." There was something final in her tone, something that made me feel like this was the end of the line, not just for the ride, but for her. I didn't know what to do, so I just nodded and waited for her to get out of the car. But she didn't. She just sat there, staring at me as if she was waiting for something. And then, in a voice so quiet I almost didn't hear it, she said, "Thank you." Before I could respond, she opened the door and stepped out into the darkness. I watched her go, my mind racing with questions, but she didn't look back. She just walked away, her figure disappearing into the shadows. I sat there for a long moment, trying to make sense of what had just happened. There was something about that woman, something that didn't add up. And then I remembered the address she'd given me. I'd heard stories about that place, rumors, really, about how it had been abandoned for years, ever since a fire had destroyed most of the buildings in the area. Some said it was haunted, that the ghosts of those who had died in the fire still lingered there, trapped in the ruins. But I didn't believe in ghosts, or at least, I didn't think I did. I put the car in gear and started to drive away, but something stopped me. A feeling, like a tug at the back of my mind, urging me to go back, to check on her, to make sure she was okay. Against my better judgment, I turned the car around and headed back to the spot where I'd dropped her off. The street was dark and empty, just as it had been before. There was no sign of her, no footprints in the snow, nothing to indicate that anyone had been there. I got out of the car, my breath visible in the cold night air, and walked over to where I had last seen her. The ground was undisturbed, the snow untouched. It was as if she had never been there. I stood there for a long time, staring at the spot where she had disappeared, my mind struggling to comprehend what had just happened. I knew what I'd seen, I knew she had been there. But now, standing in the silence, I began to doubt myself. Had it all been a hallucination, a trick of the mind brought on by exhaustion? Or was there something more to it, something I didn't want to believe? As I stood there, trying to make sense of it all, I heard a sound, a faint, distant cry, like the wail of a woman in pain. It sent a chill down my spine, and I turned to look around, but there was no one there. The street was empty, the buildings dark and silent, but the cry continued, growing louder, more insistent, until it seemed to be coming from all around me, echoing off the walls of the abandoned buildings. I felt a cold sweat break out on my forehead, my heart racing in my chest. I wanted to run, to get back in the car and drive away, but something kept me rooted to the spot, a sense of unease settling over me like a heavy weight. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the crying stopped. The silence that followed was deafening, almost suffocating. I stood there, my breath coming in short, ragged gasps, waiting for something to happen, for someone to appear. But there was nothing, just the wind, whispering through the empty streets. I don't know how long I stood there, but eventually I forced myself to move. I got back in the car and drove away, my hands shaking as I gripped the steering wheel. The city lights eventually came back into view, the familiar sights and sounds of downtown bringing a sense of normalcy, but the feeling of unease lingered. I couldn't shake the memory of that woman, the way she had looked at me, the way she had disappeared into the night without a trace. When I got home, I tried to put it out of my mind, convincing myself that it had all been a strange dream, a product of my tired mind. But deep down, I knew better. The next day, I went back to that part of town, determined to find some answers. I drove around the neighborhood, looking for any sign of her, but there was nothing. The buildings were just as abandoned and crumbling as they had been the night before, the streets empty and silent. I even tried asking around, talking to a few of the locals who still lived in the area, but no one knew anything about a woman fitting her description. In fact, they all seemed to think I was crazy for even asking. No one goes down there anymore, one old man told me, shaking his head. Not since the fire. That place is cursed, you know. Best to stay away, cursed. The word sent a shiver down my spine, but I tried to ignore it, telling myself that it was just an old man's superstition. But the more I thought about it, the more it made sense. There was something about that place, something dark and twisted, that had drawn her there, something that had kept her trapped in the shadows. I never did find out who she was or why she had needed to go to that place. But I'll never forget the look in her eyes, the way she had stared at me with such sadness, such desperation. I still drive my taxi, still pick up fares all over the city, but I avoid that part of town now, the old industrial district, where the ghosts of the past still linger in the shadows. Some nights, when the city is quiet and the streets are empty, I think about her, wonder if she ever found what she was looking for, wonder if she's still out there, waiting for another ride. But I know one thing for sure, I'll never forget the night I picked up that ghostly passenger, the night I came face to face with something that I can't explain, something that still haunts me to this day. I've always had a fascination with abandoned places. The idea of exploring forgotten buildings, walking through hallways that once buzzed with life, but now only echo with the memories of the past, has always intrigued me. So when I heard about the old St. Mary's Asylum tucked away in the woods on the outskirts of town, I knew I had to see it for myself. The asylum had been closed for over 50 years, left to decay as nature slowly reclaimed it. I'd heard the stories, of course whispers of strange occurrences, of people who had gone inside and never come back, but I didn't believe in that sort of thing. To me, it was just an adventure, a chance to see a piece of history before it was gone for good. I made my way out there one crisp autumn morning, the air thick with the smell of fallen leaves. The drive was long, the road winding through the forest, growing narrower and more overgrown the closer I got. By the time I reached the gates, it was clear that no one had been there in years. The rusted iron gates hung askew, one of them barely clinging to its hinges. Beyond them, the asylum loomed, its dark silhouette standing stark against the gray sky. The windows were broken, the roof caved in places, and the walls were covered in ivy, but it was still an imposing sight. I parked my car and grabbed my camera, eager to document what I found. As I approached the building, I noticed the silence. It wasn't just quiet, it was a kind of silence that presses down on you, that makes you feel like you're being watched. I shook off the feeling and made my way inside. The front doors were unlocked, hanging slightly open as if they were inviting me in. The lobby was just as I'd imagined it, dust-covered floors, broken furniture, and peeling wallpaper. But there was something else, something I hadn't expected. A chill hung in the air, despite the warm sun outside. I pushed forward, my footsteps echoing in the empty space. The deeper I went into the building, the more the unease grew. The hallways seemed to stretch on forever, twisting and turning in ways that didn't make sense. The rooms were empty, save for the occasional piece of furniture or forgotten medical equipment. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I found myself in what must have been the main ward, a large room filled with rows of rusted bed frames. The windows were shattered, letting in beams of light that did little to dispel the darkness. As I walked among the beds, I noticed something odd. Each one had a name carved into the headboard, some of them barely legible through the years of grime. I felt a shiver run down my spine as I read the names, each one feeling more familiar than the last. That's when I heard the faint sound of footsteps coming from the hallway behind me. I spun around, my heart racing, but there was no one there. The corridor was empty, just as it had been when I had first walked through it. But the sound continued, growing louder, closer, until it felt like it was right behind me. I backed away, my breath coming in quick, shallow gasps. The footsteps stopped, but the feeling of being watched didn't. I wanted to leave, to get out of that place as fast as I could, but something drew me deeper into the asylum. It was like a pull, a force that I couldn't resist. I found myself walking down another hallway, this one lined with doors on either side. They were all closed, the numbers above them faded and unreadable. I reached for the handle of the first door, hesitating for just a moment before pushing it open. The room inside was small, barely more than a closet, with a single chair in the center. But it wasn't the chair that caught my attention, it was the walls. They were covered in writing, word scratched into the paint, over and over again. I stepped closer, my eyes scanning the scroll letters. "Help me, they're watching. I can't get out." The phrases repeated themselves, the handwriting growing more frantic, more desperate. The deeper I read, my stomach churned as I imagined the person who had written them trapped in that tiny room, surrounded by their own fear. I backed out of the room, my hands shaking. The pull was stronger now, dragging me toward the end of the hallway, toward a door that looked different from the others. It was larger, made of metal, with a thick bolt locking it shut. I hesitated, my instincts screaming at me to turn back, but I couldn't. I had to know what was behind that door. I reached out, my fingers trembling as I grasped the bolt. It was cold, the metal biting into my skin as I slid it open. The door creaked as it swung inward, revealing a staircase leading down into the darkness. The smell hit me first damp and moldy, with an underlying scent of something I couldn't quite place, something that made my stomach turn. But I couldn't stop myself. I descended the stairs, the darkness growing thicker with each step. When I reached the bottom, I found myself in a large, open space. It was too dark to see much, but I could make out the shapes of old equipment, metal tables, and what looked like a series of cages along one wall. I fumbled for my flashlight, the beam cutting through the darkness. As I swept it across the room, that's when I saw them. They were standing in the corners, just beyond the reach of the light, their faces hidden in shadow. But I could feel their eyes on me, watching, waiting. Panic surged through me, and I backed away, my flashlight shaking in my hand. I wanted to run, to get out of that place, but my feet wouldn't move. The figures stayed where they were, unmoving, but the sense of dread was overwhelming. And then, as suddenly as they had appeared, they were gone. I blinked, my heart pounding in my chest, trying to make sense of what I had just seen. But the room was empty, just as it had been when I first entered. I turned and ran, not stopping until I was back outside, the cool air hitting my face like a splash of water. I didn't look back as I made my way to the car, my hands trembling as I fumbled with the keys. I could still feel their eyes on me, watching from the windows of the asylum as I drove away. I didn't stop driving until I was back in the city, the lights and noise a stark contrast to the oppressive silence of the asylum. I tried to forget what I'd seen, to tell myself that it was just my imagination, that the figures were nothing more than shadows. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed me, that I'd brought a piece of that place back with me. In the days that followed, I started to notice things, shadows moving in the corners of my vision, strange noises in the night, the feeling of being watched no matter where I went. I tried to ignore it, to convince myself that it was all in my head, but the feeling grew stronger, more insistent. I even went back to the asylum, hoping to find some answers, but the place was different. The door I had opened was locked again, the bolt rusted shut. The writing on the walls of that small room was gone, the names on the beds faded into nothing. It was as if the asylum had swallowed up the evidence, erasing any trace of what I had experienced. But I knew what I had seen, what I had felt, and I knew that I could never go back there again. I still think about that place sometimes, the way it felt like a living thing, watching, waiting. I wonder if anyone else has felt it, if anyone else has been drawn to that dark, forgotten place only to leave with more than they bargained for. I never went back to exploring abandoned places after that. The thrill of adventure was gone, replaced by a fear that I couldn't quite explain. I still drive by the asylum sometimes, though. It's still there, hidden away in the woods, waiting for the next person to come along to be lured inside by the promise of forgotten history. But I know better now. I know that some places are abandoned for a reason, that some doors should never be opened. And I know that whatever is inside St. Mary's Asylum is best.